This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I pulled over at that motel just before nightfall. My car engine had overheated in the desert, and I couldn't risk driving farther without a break. The neon sign blinked erratically, throwing patches of yellow light across the empty parking lot. The building itself had a faded, pale exterior, and the windows looked worn out. I grabbed my small duffel bag, locked the car, and walked into the lobby, hoping to get a room for the night and leave first thing in the morning. The front desk area was cramped. A wall behind the counter displayed dozens of keys hanging from pegs. Each key had a number attached to a small tag. A man with a creased face and gray hair stood there, silently observing me. He wore a short-sleeved button-down and had a tired look in his eyes. I felt uneasy because he didn't say a word at first. When I cleared my throat, he finally spoke. His voice was low and direct. He handed me a key labeled 22 and told me the room was down the hall to the left. He didn't ask for my ID. He didn't take payment up front. He only said, "Don't go outside after midnight." Then he turned around and disappeared through a door behind the desk. I stood there for a moment, clutching the key, feeling unsettled by his abrupt manner. I noticed the other keys on the wall swinging slightly, even though there was no strong breeze. Each key had its own chain and tag, a mismatched collection of shapes and numbers. I wondered about the rooms and who else might be staying here. I walked down the hallway. The carpet was thin and faded, and the overhead lights flickered. The door to room 22 stuck a bit, so I had to push it hard to get inside. The room itself was basic: a bed, a side table with a lamp, a small dresser, and an old TV. A single window looked out onto the parking lot. The paint on the walls peeled in spots. The air felt stale, so I opened the window slightly, letting in a faint whiff of desert air. I set my bag on the bed and checked my phone. No signal. That didn't surprise me, given the remote location. I decided to take a quick shower. The water pressure was weak, and the temperature fluctuated, but I managed to cool down from the long, hot drive. Afterward, I toweled off and slipped into fresh clothes. My stomach growled. I realized I hadn't eaten since midday. I recalled passing a diner a few miles back, but I didn't have the energy to drive again. I checked the room's nightstand for any takeout menus or local info. Nothing. I told myself I'd just deal with the hunger until morning. I tried turning on the TV. It showed static on most channels, but I found a fuzzy local station playing an old sitcom. I half-watched it while lying on the bed, not really following the plot. My eyelids felt heavy. The day's heat and stress had worn me out. I drifted into a light sleep. Sometime later, I woke up to a strange ticking noise. It sounded like a clock. I searched the room. There was no clock on the wall, no alarm on the table, yet the ticking continued, steady and slow. Curious, I followed the sound to the door. The corridor was dark except for a dim overhead bulb near the lobby. I heard a faint hum coming from the other end of the hallway. I stepped out, ignoring the manager's warning about staying inside after midnight. My watch said it was only 11:15, so I figured I had some time before midnight anyway. The hallway felt stuffy, and the air smelled stale, like old carpeting mixed with dust. I made my way toward the reception area. The keys on the wall were all moving subtly, swaying back and forth, producing a light chattering sound as the metal tags bumped each other. It reminded me of wind chimes, only there was no wind. The front desk was empty. I noticed no sign of the manager. The ticking noise was louder here, but I couldn't identify its source. My pulse quickened. The whole setting felt off. I stepped behind the desk, looking for some explanation. There was a ledger book, faded receipts, and a single desk lamp. No ticking device. The old telephone sat silent. Then I heard faint whispers, like 2 or 3 voices overlapping. My ears strained to pick up the words, but I couldn't make them out. They seemed to come from behind a nearby door. I considered knocking but felt an odd fear. My hands felt clammy. I remembered the manager's warning not to wander after midnight, and I glanced at my watch. 11:27. I decided to return to my room. The corridor felt even darker than before, and my footsteps sounded loud on the thin carpet. As I reached room 22, I felt a sudden wave of warmth. I touched the doorknob. It felt hot, as if someone had been gripping it. I hesitated. Then I heard a scraping noise inside my room, like furniture moving. I pressed my ear to the door. I could feel my heart pounding. Another gentle scrape, then silence. I swallowed the lump in my throat and eased the door open. The lights were off, and the curtains were closed. I was sure I had left one lamp on. The bed was still there, the TV off, but the air felt heavier. My eyes struggled to adjust, but I saw no one inside. I stood in the doorway, every muscle tense. After a few seconds, I found the lamp on the nightstand and turned it back on. It flickered. The furniture looked exactly as I left it, except the chair near the dresser was slightly angled. I couldn't be certain it hadn't been that way. My mind might have been playing tricks. I walked around, checking the bathroom. Empty. I locked the door behind me and double-checked the window latch. It was still secure. My watch read 11:35. I decided to stay put until morning, but I couldn't relax. The ticking noise resumed, echoing in my ears. I paced the room, pressing my ear to the walls. It wasn't coming from the walls. It felt like it was everywhere. My hands shook. I sat on the edge of the bed, focusing on slow, steady breaths. The hum of the air conditioner started up, rattling the old vent, which momentarily drowned out the ticking. At around 11:50, I heard a faint jingle from the hallway. It was the sound of the hanging keys. I remembered how they swayed by themselves. My heart sped up. Part of me wanted to open the door and look, but I also recalled the manager's warning. I told myself it was only 10 more minutes until midnight, and maybe I should stay put like he said. Anxiety gnawed at my stomach. Then I heard footsteps just outside my door. I froze. The steps were quick and light, as if someone was running by. I rushed to the door, peered through the peephole, and saw only an empty corridor. The lights flickered. My watch hit 11:59. That final minute stretched on. The corridor lights made a buzzing sound, and the overhead fixture in my room blinked once, then stayed on. When my watch switched to 12 the ticking ceased abruptly. The entire motel felt still. Relieved at the sudden silence, I sat back on the bed. I waited, listening. Nothing happened for a few minutes. I exhaled, thinking maybe the manager's warning was just local superstition. My pulse began to slow. Then a faint moan came from somewhere on the other side of the wall. It startled me to my feet. The moan rose in volume, became a slight wail, then vanished. My skin crawled. I grabbed the key on the nightstand, the one labeled 22, and noticed it felt warm. I set it down again, trying to steady my breathing. I spent the next hours dozing on and off, jumpy at every sound. A few times I heard the hall lights buzz or a distant slam, but I stayed in my room, remembering the warning. By the time morning light seeped through the edges of the curtains, I felt exhausted and tense. My phone said it was 6:30 a.m., so I got dressed and decided to check out as soon as possible. I gathered my bag and the key. My hands shook from lack of sleep. I walked down the hallway toward the front desk. The manager stood behind the counter, staring at me with a flat expression. He noticed the key in my hand. His lips tightened into a thin line. He slowly extended his palm. I placed the key there, expecting to pay for the room. He said nothing about payment. Instead, he asked, "Did anything happen?" I hesitated. I didn't want to sound confused or scared. I managed to say, "I heard some noises. The keys were moving by themselves. The lights flickered." His expression didn't change. He simply nodded. He took the key, placed it on a hook, and I noticed every other key on the wall was still. Only the key to room 22 wobbled a bit, then hung still. I waited, unsure if I should say more. He spoke in a low voice. "Next time, keep the key. Don't bring it back." I blinked, unsure what he meant. I looked around. The motel lobby had harsh morning sunlight streaming through the windows, making the dusty floor visible. The neon sign outside was now off, but its letters looked chipped. I said, "I need to settle the bill." He shook his head. "No charge for the night," he replied. I opened my mouth to argue, but the look on his face stopped me. He turned away, fiddling with a ledger. His hunched shoulders told me he was done talking. Unease pulsed in my chest. I decided not to push it. I left the lobby and stepped into the morning heat. The desert air felt cooler than I expected, or maybe I was still spooked. My car was where I left it. The engine had cooled, and after checking the fluid, I was confident it could run again. I hopped in, started the engine, and pulled onto the highway. My gaze flicked up to the rearview mirror more times than I'd like to admit, half expecting to see something behind me. But the road was empty. As I drove away, my thoughts churned with questions. The manager's warning about midnight, the swaying keys, and that final statement. "Next time, keep the key. Don't bring it back." I had no idea what it meant. Did the motel hold on to something from each guest who returned a key? I felt a twinge of regret that I gave him the key instead of pocketing it. But I tried to push it out of my mind, focusing on the long drive ahead. About an hour later, I stopped at a gas station. I got a coffee and tried to shake off the feeling of gloom lingering from that place. My hands still felt cold, even under the warm sun. I made small talk with the cashier, who asked if I was just passing through. I wanted to mention the motel, but decided it would sound too strange. I filled up the tank and continued on my way. In the days that followed, I occasionally recalled the ticking noise, the flickering lights, and the manager's expressionless face. At night, I had trouble sleeping, imagining keys rattling in a silent corridor. I told a friend about the experience, leaving out the weirder details. Even the sanitized version sounded unsettling. My friend joked that I must have wandered into a haunted spot, and I laughed nervously. I never learned the motel's exact story. I didn't see any listing for it online. My best guess is that it's one of those local places with a past no one likes to talk about. Maybe the manager stays there out of obligation, or he's part of something I'll never understand. Sometimes I wonder what might have happened if I'd kept the key. Would it have followed me home? Would I have escaped the odd events entirely, or would they have grown worse? Now, whenever I drive through Arizona, I avoid that stretch of road. If my route forces me near Tucson, I choose a different motel, even if it's more expensive or inconvenient. The memory of that silent corridor and the gentle clinking of keys is enough to keep me away. I can't forget the way those room numbers seemed to sway in the stale air, as if each key carried a story, waiting for someone to return it. If there's one lesson I took from that night, it's this: trust your instincts when something feels wrong. When an old man in a desert motel says, "Don't go outside after midnight," I listen. and I make sure I don't hand back a key if I sense there's a deeper cost hidden behind a free room. I started working at the Old Market in Portland, Maine, about 2 months ago. It's a large, historic building with a wooden floor and rows of vendors selling fish, produce, and crafts. My manager, Mr. Graham, assigned me to help with stocking goods and organizing the back areas. After a few weeks, he told me that I needed to clean and catalog items in the basement. He said it was mostly unused storage space, but it had been accumulating dust and junk for years. When I first went down there, I expected a cramped, dark cellar. Instead, I found a wide room with an arched ceiling supported by stone walls. The basement smelled of old fish and sea salt. Water dripped in one corner, forming a small puddle on the concrete. Wooden crates, some labeled and others blank, were stacked against the walls. Several boxes had come from old vendors who had moved out long ago. Mr. Graham told me to sort through them and see if anything could be salvaged or sold. I set up a small workstation near the bottom of the stairs with a portable light because the basement's overhead bulbs were dim. The floorboards above creaked whenever people walked around in the main market. Voices and footsteps filtered down, muffled. I felt a bit uneasy, but I figured it was just an unfamiliar space, so I tried to ignore the tension in my shoulders. My job was to open each crate, list the contents, and decide whether we should keep or discard them. I started with the smaller boxes, which contained old kitchen utensils, chipped ceramic plates, and handmade trinkets. Most were dusty or broken. Some pieces looked interesting, but they didn't seem valuable. After an hour, I stood up to stretch my legs. That's when I noticed a corner I hadn't paid attention to yet. It was darker there, with a tall shelf covered by a torn sheet. I approached it, shining my flashlight. Under the sheet, I saw a life-size wooden figure. It wore an old fisherman's coat and hat, like something from decades ago. Its face was carved with rudimentary features, but the eyes had an odd shine to them, as though they had been lacquered separately. The paint on the figure was peeling, and the coat felt damp and rubbery when I touched it. My first reaction was surprise. I figured it was some kind of antique display piece. The basement's moisture probably damaged it over time. I stepped back, observing the figure. Its stance was slightly forward, as if leaning against the shelf. The carved face had a blank expression, but the eyes felt strangely lifelike when my flashlight moved over them. My stomach tightened. I tried to laugh it off, reminding myself it was just a wooden model. Still, I couldn't shake the discomfort I felt. I grabbed a nearby cloth and tried wiping some of the moisture from its coat, but it stayed clammy to the touch. I moved on to other crates, hoping to distract myself. Occasionally, I glanced back at the fisherman figure, half expecting it to shift or move. My flashlight created shadows, making the corners of the basement look deeper. The dripping water sound grew more noticeable each time I stopped working. Sometimes I thought I heard a faint tapping noise, but I convinced myself it was just the water droplets. Over the next few days, I spent a couple of hours each afternoon down there. I opened more crates, sorted items, and stacked them in labeled sections. The damp smell in the basement clung to my clothes. I often felt I wasn't alone, though I could hear no one else. The old fisherman figure seemed to change position slightly whenever I wasn't looking. At first, I assumed I had just forgotten its exact angle, but one day I noticed its arm was raised higher than before. Another time, it looked turned a few degrees toward me. My heart pounded when I realized the difference. I told myself maybe I brushed against it without noticing. One evening, just before closing time, I was finishing the last box for the day. Mr. Graham had already gone home, and most vendors had packed up. I heard the market's main door close upstairs, leaving me alone in the building. I decided to do one final sweep of the basement. My flashlight began to flicker, so I tapped it to keep it steady. I approached the fisherman figure again, planning to drape the sheet back over it. I paused. Its face seemed slightly tilted, almost as if it was looking to its left. I stood still, listening to my own breathing. My muscles tensed. I tried to rationalize the change. Maybe the base was uneven, and it slowly shifted on its own. I reached out to place the sheet over it. The figure's coat felt even damper than before, almost slimy. I jerked my hand back. The smell in that corner was stronger, like rotting wood mixed with seaweed. My eyes watered. I quickly pulled the sheet down over the figure's head and stepped away, swallowing the lump in my throat. A soft scraping sound made me whip around, but I saw nothing else moving. I grabbed my bag and rushed upstairs, deciding to finish the rest of my tasks in the morning. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The image of that wooden figure kept popping into my head. I pictured its carved eyes staring at me. I recalled the wet texture of the coat. My chest felt tight whenever I replayed that moment. I tried to focus on the mundane aspects of the job, cataloging boxes, sorting old dishes. But my mind returned to the fisherman figure again and again. The next day, I asked one of the older vendors if she knew anything about the wooden fisherman. She shrugged and said she'd heard rumors of odd maritime artifacts stored in the basement, but she never saw any. I decided not to press her. I went downstairs, determined to get through my shift efficiently. The basement felt heavier that day. The air was thick, and my flashlight illuminated swirling dust particles. I noticed fresh damp spots on the walls, as if recent water seepage had occurred. The crates looked more worn than before, and some labels had peeled away. I approached the fisherman figure slowly. The sheet still covered it, though it appeared slightly crooked, as if something underneath had moved. My pulse quickened. I saw wet footprints on the concrete, leading from the figure's corner to the center of the room, then back again. They looked like partial impressions, as if someone with a soggy cloth shoe had walked across. I crouched down to touch one. The moisture soaked into my fingertip. My heart pounded. I glanced around, trying to see if there was a leaking pipe or some other explanation. The footprints didn't line up with any dripping water. I felt my palms sweat. Ignoring the panic in my chest, I removed the sheet in one quick motion. The figure leaned closer, its face angled toward me. The eyes appeared glossier than before. I stepped backward, struggling to keep my flashlight steady. The fisherman's coat dripped with water. A small puddle had formed at the base. I wanted to run upstairs, but I felt rooted to the spot, both terrified and curious. I lifted my flashlight, shining it into the figure's face. The wood around the mouth looked slightly warped, as if it had been wet for too long. The coat's sleeves ended in stiff cuffs, but near one cuff, the wood had a spongy texture. Suddenly, I heard a scraping sound from behind me. I spun around, pointing the flashlight, but all I saw were crates. I looked back at the figure. It remained still, though water droplets clung to the edges of the coat. My breathing was shallow. I forced myself to look away and focus on the crates I needed to finish cataloging. For the next half hour, I tried to ignore the figure, keeping my attention on the boxes. The hair on the back of my neck stood up the entire time. I felt like I was being watched. At one point, I sneezed from the dust, and I heard a soft creak behind me. I turned to see the figure leaning at a new angle. My chest tightened, and I nearly dropped the flashlight. The path to the stairs lay on the other side of the figure, so I had no choice but to pass it. Each step felt heavier than the last. I inched around the perimeter of the room, keeping my distance. It felt like the figure's carved eyes followed me, though it never truly moved while I was looking at it. My stomach felt like a knot. As I passed, the coat's sleeve brushed my leg. The fabric was cold and damp. I yanked my leg away. My heart pounded in my ears. I forced myself to continue until I reached the stairs. I bounded up 2 steps at a time, refusing to look back. When I reached the top, I pulled the basement door shut and locked it. My breathing was ragged. I leaned against the door for a moment, trying to compose myself. That evening, I reported the water leakage to Mr. Graham. I didn't mention the figure's changes because I knew how it would sound. He said he would have someone check the basement's pipes soon. I decided not to stay late anymore. Each day I did my work upstairs, hoping I wouldn't be asked to go down there again. But one afternoon, Mr. Graham insisted I bring up some old items to display at a small antique stall in the market. I had to go back. With my flashlight in hand, I opened the basement door. The odor of stale water and fishy dampness hit me. I swallowed my dread and stepped inside, flipping on the overhead light this time. It cast a weak glow, but it helped a bit. I scanned the room. The fisherman figure stood in the corner, uncovered. The sheet lay crumpled on the floor by its feet. My skin prickled with goosebumps. I moved quickly, grabbing the crates I needed and stacking them near the stairs. Suddenly, I heard slow dripping. I glanced toward the figure. Its coat dripped a steady line of water onto the concrete. Then I noticed the eyes seemed to catch the light, reflecting it back at me. My pulse raced. I grabbed the last box, turned, and headed for the stairs. Halfway up, I heard a wet dragging sound. It made my whole body tense. I didn't turn around. I bolted up the rest of the steps, nearly tripping on the top step. I slammed the door behind me, boxes in hand. My chest heaved. I felt sweat on my forehead. That was the last time I entered the basement alone. The next week, a contractor came to inspect the area and found unusual water damage in that corner. He removed the fisherman figure and said it was beyond repair. He didn't look comfortable touching it, but he hauled it away. I asked where he took it, and he just shrugged, saying he would dump it somewhere. Ever since, the basement still has an odd smell, but not as strong. The crates remain half-sorted, and no one seems eager to finish the job. When I work upstairs, I sometimes hear faint scraping noises, but I tell myself it's just the old building settling. I avoid that basement door unless absolutely necessary. I still wonder if that fisherman figure was just a warped piece of wood with a mold problem, or something else entirely. I recall those footprints, the coat's damp texture, and the shifting positions. My chest tightens whenever I think about those eyes, shining under my flashlight. Even now, I catch myself glancing around corners, expecting to see it leaning toward me. I don't share the full story with anyone at work. They'd think I was imagining things, but I know what I saw and felt in that basement. Every time I pass by the old stairwell, I feel an uneasy chill, and I speed up my pace. I have no desire to relive those moments. The memory is enough to make me avoid dark corners and damp places for a long time. I first noticed the old tea house while walking down a quiet street in Hartford's historical center. I saw the faded sign, Rosemary's Tea & Co., hanging above a dusty door. The building had stained glass windows covered in grime. Something about it stood out, even though most people seemed to pass by without a glance. I felt drawn to it. I love vintage settings and old-fashioned decor, so I decided to step inside. Pushing the door open took more effort than I expected. It creaked loudly, and I heard a small bell jingle overhead. I waited for someone to greet me, but no one appeared. The air inside felt heavy with dust. The sunlight through the cloudy windows cast a grayish glow over the room. Several wooden tables and chairs were laid out in an orderly fashion, as if expecting customers. They were coated in a thin layer of powdery dust. I stepped forward, and the floorboards squeaked under my weight. My heart rate ticked up. I didn't expect the place to feel so deserted. I approached the main counter. On it stood a row of porcelain cups and saucers with floral patterns. They looked delicate, but they were grimy. There was a menu on the counter, hand-lettered in fading ink. It listed various teas with names I didn't recognize. No prices were shown. The smell in the air shifted. I picked up a faint aroma of rose petals. It was subtle at first, then grew stronger, like someone had just brewed rose tea in another room. My stomach fluttered. I looked around again, searching for any sign of a person. There was only silence. Behind the counter, a door led to what appeared to be the kitchen or a back room. I leaned closer and noticed a partial glimpse of dusty countertops. Then I heard the clink of porcelain. It was soft, like someone was handling a teapot. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" No one answered. My voice echoed dully. The porcelain sound stopped. I felt a chill ripple across my skin. I ran my hand across the dusty countertop, then stepped away and moved toward the main seating area. A single table near the window caught my eye. A tattered napkin lay on it, and a small sugar bowl sat half open. I found an old card in the sugar bowl. The card said, "Special blend of the day," in fancy script, with a faint design of roses. It looked as though it had been left out for years. A sense of unease crept into my chest. I turned and peered around. The silence felt too thick. I debated whether to leave, but curiosity pulled me deeper. I stepped through a side archway leading to what might have been a smaller lounge area. It had ornate chairs, an antique sideboard, and a tall mirror with a tarnished frame. The dust was even heavier in here. As I neared the mirror, I noticed a vague outline of a figure in it, like a reflection that wasn't mine. I froze, every muscle in my body tightening. My heart pounded. I blinked and looked again. The shape vanished. I told myself it was the lighting or my imagination. Still, my hands trembled. I backed away from the mirror and returned to the main room. The rose scent grew stronger. It reminded me of fresh petals, not like an old, stale fragrance. It was almost pleasant, but it made the space feel more unsettling because I couldn't see a single fresh flower or anything else that could produce such a smell. I noticed my breathing had sped up. The back of my neck felt warm. I debated leaving again, but I took another few steps toward the door behind the counter. Something about the clinking I heard earlier made me want to investigate. When I entered the kitchen, I saw rows of teapots and cups arranged neatly on open shelves. A few pots had traces of dried tea leaves at the bottom, as if someone had used them and never washed them. The sink was filled with dust-laden cups. A kettle sat on the stove, but the stove was off. My footsteps were loud on the tile floor. I reached out and touched one of the teapots. The handle felt slightly warm. That made no sense because the room felt cool, and I saw no active heat source. My stomach lurched with unease. Then a slight movement near the far corner caught my eye. I lifted a hand to shield my vision from the dim overhead light. I realized it was a curtain swaying. There was no draft I could detect. I approached it, half expecting someone to pop out. My heart pounded so hard that I could hear blood rushing in my ears, but the curtain simply hung there, swaying gently. I touched it, and it felt still under my fingers. No breeze, no open window. I stepped back, confused. I turned around, and the kettle on the stove emitted a soft rattling sound. I stared at it, waiting for a logical explanation. I saw no movement in the kettle, but the rattling continued for a few seconds and stopped. I whispered under my breath, "This is too strange." I wanted to leave, yet I felt glued to the spot. My legs felt stiff. I heard a faint shuffle behind me. I spun around, shining my phone's flashlight into the corner by the shelves. Nothing. The hairs on my arms rose. The rose scent intensified to a near claustrophobic level. I coughed, feeling like I was inhaling thick perfume. My eyes teared up a bit from the intensity of the smell. I stepped away from the stove, heading back into the main tea room. Once I got there, I froze. A teacup sat on one of the tables, steaming lightly. I hadn't seen any steam or any hot water before. My heart jumped. I approached the cup cautiously. The liquid inside was pale pink. I could smell rose. I leaned closer and felt heat rising from it. This was fresh tea. My hands shook. I touched the cup's handle with one fingertip. It was warm, like it had just been poured. My mind raced. There was no sign of any other person. No footsteps, no talking, no kettle boiling. I looked around for a place to set my phone down or something to defend myself, but the environment was still and quiet. That's when I noticed the silhouette in the dusty window reflection. It looked like a woman wearing an old-fashioned dress. She stood behind me, too close. My stomach clenched. I spun around so fast that I nearly stumbled over a chair, but I saw no one in the room. In that moment, the overhead lights flickered. I heard the bell on the door jingle by itself, though the door didn't open. My pulse pounded in my temples. I stared at the main entrance, half expecting it to swing open, but it stayed shut. The jingle died away. The tea room returned to a deafening silence. I felt sweat on my brow and wiped it with my sleeve. Then I glanced back at the teacup. Steam still rose. My curiosity overcame my sense of fear. I lifted the cup and smelled it. It was clearly rose tea. My hand trembled. I tasted a tiny sip. The flavor was strong, slightly sweet, like rose petals steeped in hot water. I quickly set the cup down, my heart beating even harder. I felt almost lightheaded. I decided I needed to leave immediately. I didn't care about exploring more. I wanted out. I headed for the door. As I crossed the threshold, I felt a sudden release of pressure, like stepping out of a thick fog. The street outside was bright in comparison. I looked back at the tea house. In the daylight, the windows seemed more boarded up than I remembered. The door appeared locked. I could see dust swirling inside, but no sign of movement. The sign above still read, "Rosemary's Tea & Co., but it looked even more weathered. My spine tingled. I walked away, trying to clear my head. My heart still raced. My hands felt clammy, and the back of my shirt stuck to my skin. I had no explanation for what I experienced. I found a bench nearby and sat down, catching my breath. I considered whether I should tell someone, but I wasn't sure who. It sounded too bizarre to share with a stranger. After a few minutes, I calmed down enough to stand and slowly make my way back to my car. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the tea house. The smell of roses seemed stuck in my nostrils. I took a shower, trying to wash away any dust or lingering scent. My mind replayed the rattling kettle, the curtains swaying, and especially that fresh cup of tea. Each time I felt my chest tighten. I ended up going to bed late because I was afraid I'd dream about it. For the next few days, I researched the address online. I found only sparse mentions of a Victorian tea house in Hartford that closed decades ago after the owner's death. Some references mentioned a woman named Rosemary, who was famous for her rose blends. There were rumors of unusual occurrences in the building afterward, but no concrete details. The city records showed the place had been shuttered and never reopened officially. I drove by once more during daylight just to see if it looked different. The windows were still dusty, the door obviously locked. I peered in through a narrow gap, but it was too dark to see much. I saw no chairs or tables, just shadows. My heartbeat rose again, so I left quickly. I had the strong feeling that the encounter I had experienced was unique or possibly personal, like I had stumbled into a moment in time that shouldn't have existed. That idea made me uneasy. Even now, I sometimes smell a faint rose scent at odd moments. I'll be at home or at the office and suddenly catch a whiff of it. My skin prickles when that happens, and I recall the dusty tea room and that warm teacup. I haven't told many people about this. Most would assume I'm exaggerating or chasing a weird fantasy. But I know what I felt in that tea house. It wasn't a normal place. Something was there, or maybe still is, serving a last cup of rose tea to anyone who dares to enter. I keep warning anyone who mentions they like exploring old buildings in Hartford. Don't go into that tea house. If it's even possible to enter again, I suspect the experience won't be pleasant. I can't explain where that tea came from or why I smelled a fresh brew in a place that seemed abandoned for decades. But the memory stays with me. My hands still shake when I think about picking up that teacup and feeling the warmth of freshly steeped tea in a deserted shop. It was too real to be a dream and too strange to be a normal encounter. I have no plans to return, but the memory remains vivid. The rose flavor, the dusty atmosphere, and that brief glimpse of a figure behind me feel like a warning I can't forget. I first learned about that mirror park when I got lost on the outskirts of Austin. I had been driving around trying to find a small street art installation that a friend told me about. My phone's GPS kept rerouting me, so I ended up in a rundown neighborhood near an abandoned warehouse district. As I drove along a cracked road, I spotted a sign on a rusty fence that said Mirror Park in letters that looked hand-painted and faded. There was a tall chain-link gate, but it stood open, and I could see some shiny objects on the other side. I felt curious and pulled over to check it out. The entrance had a small plaque, too worn to read properly. I noticed dozens of reflective panels sticking out of the ground a few yards away, arranged in some kind of pattern. It was late afternoon, so the sun hit those panels at an angle, creating flashes of light that caught my eye. I walked closer, seeing that the panels were mirrors, some cracked or discolored. There was a pathway between them, as if someone had tried to create a maze. I remembered reading about an eccentric artist in Austin who liked using mirrors in public installations. I wondered if this was his work. The place seemed empty. I looked around for any sign of a caretaker or other visitors. No one was there. A slight breeze rustled some tall grass near the edges of the property. I felt the warm Texas air on my face. The sunlight felt strong, and I squinted behind my sunglasses. I decided to explore. The fence around the area was old, and part of it had collapsed on one side. Graffiti covered the walls of a nearby building. I picked a spot to enter the arrangement of mirrors. As soon as I stepped onto a narrow walkway, I saw my reflection multiplied across several panels. The effect was disorienting. Some mirrors stood upright, others leaned at angles, and many had cracks that distorted the reflections. My first thought was that this would have been a cool art piece if it had been maintained, but I also felt a twinge of unease. The broken mirrors showed my face in odd shapes, and the place felt abandoned. Still, I moved forward, scanning the ground for loose debris so I wouldn't trip. About 10 feet in, the path curved left, then right. Mirrors of different sizes formed walls on either side. I could see the sky reflected above me and some overgrown grass at my feet. Occasionally, I heard a scraping noise, but I couldn't identify the source. It might have been the wind pushing a loose panel. The dryness of the air made my throat scratchy, and I wished I had brought water. As I advanced, the reflections got more confusing. One panel had dark spots from rust or mold, creating a strange pattern over the image of my face. Another mirror was clean but slightly angled, so it caught a glimpse of something behind me. At first, I thought it was just my own reflection, but I noticed a dark shape that didn't match my body. I turned around, shining my phone's flashlight into the area behind me. There was nothing there, just more mirrors and weeds. My chest tightened a bit. I told myself it was just some optical effect. I tried to keep calm. I stepped around a broken chunk of glass on the ground, thinking about the possibility of cutting my foot if I slipped. The path continued through a series of metal frames that held the mirrors upright. Some frames wobbled when I brushed past them. The entire structure seemed neglected, as if no one had tended to it in years. My foot kicked a rusted plate on the ground, and it made a loud clang. The noise startled me, making me grip my phone tighter. I paused to steady my breathing. The next stretch of the path brought me to an area where the mirrors stood closer together, forming almost a corridor. My reflection appeared on all sides, overlapping in weird angles. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, which interlaced with the mirrored images. I felt a tingle along my arms, like the air had gotten heavier. I turned a corner, and something flickered in the mirror to my right. I whipped my head toward it and saw a second reflection of me, but the movement was off by a fraction of a second, as if the reflection lagged. I blinked hard, chalking it up to my eyes playing tricks. I decided to move faster, partly out of curiosity and partly because I wanted to find the exit. The mirrored pathways kept splitting, though. I started to suspect it was a labyrinth. I tried to leave mental markers, like a crack in one mirror or a certain piece of graffiti on another, but everything looked similar. Most panels were old, chipped, or covered in random smudges. My shoes crunched on gravel and broken glass, and I had to watch my step. After a few minutes, I realized I didn't know how to get back to where I started. I felt my pulse quicken. I told myself it was fine. I'd just keep turning corners and eventually find the fence. But the corridors wound around in unexpected ways. I made a right, then a left, and hit a dead end formed by 3 mirrors. Each panel reflected me at a slightly different angle. I turned around, doubling back, and found another passage. The sky was starting to shift in color, hinting that sunset would come soon. I didn't want to be trapped in this place at night. At one point, I passed a mirror with a large diagonal crack across it. As I looked at my reflection, I saw a faint shape behind me in the glass. It looked like a person, but the figure was dark, almost featureless. My heart skipped. I spun around. No one was there. I felt a chill crawl up my neck. I started moving more quickly. My shoes scuffed against the ground, and I kicked a small shard of mirror that slid ahead of me. I tried not to stare too long at any reflection, but my eyes kept flicking to the corners of the mirrors to check for movement. That was when I heard a quiet laugh. It sounded distant but clear enough to be human. I froze in place, listening. The laugh didn't repeat, but my body tensed up. My palms were sweaty around my phone. My mouth felt dry. I tried to call out hello, but my voice came out weak. The labyrinth stayed silent. I took another step, and my shoe squeaked on some metal debris, echoing strangely among the mirrors. Further along, I found a small clearing in the center of the installation. It looked like an open square with a broken signpost at the middle. The signpost was crooked, and the sign was too faded to read. The ground around it was littered with shards of broken glass, as if a large mirror had once stood there and collapsed. I paused to catch my breath. My legs felt stiff, and my shoulders ached from tension. I thought about calling someone, but I had no idea who to call or how they would find me. My phone still had battery, though, so I checked the time. I realized I had been wandering this place for nearly half an hour. I turned toward one of the paths leading out of the square. Before I could take a step, I heard a loud crash. It sounded like a large piece of glass falling off its frame. The noise echoed all around. My heart pounded against my rib cage. I whipped my head around, trying to locate the direction. It had come from behind me, near another cluster of mirrors. I felt a surge of panic. I muttered, "I have to get out of here," under my breath. I chose the path to my left, hoping it led to the outer fence. The labyrinth twisted again. Some mirrors were so damaged they barely reflected anything. Others were intact but angled oddly, showing me glimpses of the sky and the back of my head. I kept moving, occasionally trying to peer over the top of the mirrors to see if I could spot an exit, but they stood too tall for me to see beyond them without climbing. I worried about disturbing the unstable frames if I tried that. At one point, a reflection in front of me showed someone behind me again, like a human shape crossing from left to right. I spun around, shining my phone light, but the corridor was empty except for me. I felt a knot in my stomach. My breathing got shallow. I forced myself to keep moving, telling myself it was just the trick of overlapping reflections. Finally, I saw a gap in the fence through the next line of mirrors. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with dread. I moved toward it, stepping around a thick piece of metal pipe on the ground. As I reached the final set of mirrors, I heard a sudden thud behind me. My body jerked in surprise, and I almost dropped my phone. I turned to look, and one mirror at the end of the corridor had fallen forward, leaning against another. The sound must have been that. Nothing else was visible, but I felt an overwhelming urge to run. I ducked through the gap in the fence without a second thought. My footsteps crunched on gravel as I hurried back to my car. Once I was outside the enclosure, I felt the warm evening air on my face and realized I was breathing too fast. I paused by the car door, looked back at the tangled maze of mirrors, and saw the last rays of daylight reflecting off several cracked surfaces. My chest tightened again, remembering the laughter and those fleeting shapes in the reflections. I got into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. I felt a tremor in my hands, and my shirt stuck to my back from sweat. I drove away, glancing at the rearview mirror every few seconds. My mind replayed the moments when I saw that dark figure behind me and the weird second of lag in my reflection. I felt like I had escaped a claustrophobic trap. That night, I struggled to fall asleep. I couldn't stop thinking about the deserted park, the swirling maze of mirrors, and the random laughter. My body kept replaying the tension in my shoulders and the dryness in my throat. I texted a friend about it, but I kept my message vague. I didn't want to sound paranoid or unhinged. The memory of those reflections still made my heart pound. In the days that followed, I read up on local forums. A few posts mentioned the Mirror Park as an abandoned art installation that never got finished. Some people claimed that the artist believed mirrors could act as portals for souls. Others said it was just a unique concept that got left to decay after the artist died. No one had an official explanation for the stories about strange sights or sounds there. Even now, I occasionally recall my reflection glitching in that cracked panel, and I feel a wave of unease. I wonder if it was just the angle of the mirrors messing with my perception, or if there was something else lurking in that labyrinth. My gut says not to go back, even if I'm curious. I didn't see anyone else in that place, but I can't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. When I think about the moment I heard that quiet laugh, my pulse speeds up, and a chill runs through me. I keep telling myself I'll forget it eventually, but part of me knows it's etched in my memory. If someone asks me about hidden spots in Austin, I leave out any mention of that mirror park. I have no desire to lead them into that kind of experience. I still get tense when I pass by deserted areas with weird art structures. There's a hint of fear that something might appear behind me, just out of sight, reflected in the corner of a broken mirror. I decided to visit the old coal mine in the Pocono Mountains after hearing local rumors about eerie sounds from beneath the ground. My friends warned me that it was dangerous and probably off limits, but I couldn't shake my curiosity. I wanted to see the place for myself and maybe gather some samples. I'm not a professional geologist, but I've always had a casual interest in rock formations. I packed a small backpack with water, a flashlight, and a headlamp, then drove out one Saturday morning. The entrance to the mine looked rugged and uninviting. A rusty sign warned trespassers to stay away. The lettering was barely visible. There were large wooden beams bracing the tunnel mouth, and some of them had collapsed on one side, leaving gaps wide enough to squeeze through. The air around the entrance felt stale, and I noticed an odd metallic odor that lingered even outside. I paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and reminded myself to move carefully. I put on my headlamp, checked my flashlight, and stepped into the darkness. My first impression was how the space felt cramped. The ceiling seemed low, though it was probably the same height as a normal room. The walls were damp in patches, with small droplets forming in the cracks. The floor was uneven, covered with loose gravel and bits of old debris. Each step made a crunching sound. I moved slowly, scanning the walls with my light. I spotted old rails on the ground that once guided mining carts. They were heavily rusted. As I walked deeper, the natural light from the entrance faded, and I had to rely solely on my headlamp. The smell grew stronger, an earthy mix of dust and iron. I felt my nerves tighten because I knew I was alone in a place that had seen accidents in the past. My heart rate picked up. My stomach felt a little uneasy. I told myself to remain calm and remember the path so I could return without getting lost. I came across some machinery parts about 50 feet in, gears, engine fragments, and old metal drums. They looked like they'd been left in a hurry. The dust covering them was thick, and a thin layer of rust flaked off whenever I brushed against anything. I heard a faint echo. It sounded like my own movement at first, but it carried a hollow quality that reminded me the tunnels might extend far in different directions. After several minutes, I reached an area where the shaft narrowed, forcing me to bend forward. I saw the remains of old wooden support beams. Some were broken and half fallen. I had to carefully maneuver around them. The air felt drier here, and I caught a metallic taste on my tongue. My breathing sounded louder in my ears. My clothes started to stick to my skin from sweat. The temperature hadn't risen, but my nerves made me sweat. Then I heard a sound that didn't come from me. It was a soft moan or whisper carried by some draft. I froze, shining my light in all directions. I saw only rock walls and old beams. My heart pounded. I had read stories about trapped miners' spirits wandering these tunnels. I shook my head, trying not to let my imagination take over. I decided to press forward. A little farther in, I found a side corridor that branched off. It sloped downward. The rails continued in that direction, so I assumed it was the main route. A sign on the wall read, "Level 2" in peeling paint. I paused and listened for more sounds. It was quiet except for occasional drips of water hitting metal. I stepped carefully down the slope, holding onto the wall to steady myself. I reached a small chamber where a couple of carts were still on the tracks. They were tilted, one nearly on its side. There was nothing inside them except lumps of coal turned gray with age. I touched one piece, feeling the residue on my fingers. It smeared black across my skin. I wiped it on a rag I had in my backpack. That's when I felt a sudden draft of cool air against my face. It startled me because I hadn't felt any breeze so far. The air came from deeper inside, where the darkness seemed thicker. I followed the draft, passing more collapsed timbers and a few corroded tools. One was a pickaxe lying half buried in the dirt. Its handle was rotted, but the metal head was still intact. Seeing these items made me picture how busy this place must have been decades ago, with workers pushing carts and digging the walls. Now it felt like a graveyard of old equipment. While I walked, a slow heaviness settled in my chest. It was like the atmosphere weighed on me. My arms felt tense, and my back started aching. I kept looking over my shoulder. I sensed a presence, even though I couldn't see or hear anyone. The silence played tricks on my mind. Once, I tripped on a loose rock, and my flashlight fell. The clatter echoed in a long, eerie way. I swore under my breath and quickly picked up the flashlight, checking for damage. It still worked. My heart hammered, and I forced myself to breathe steadily. Further in, I heard another noise, like the squeak of wheels. It came from somewhere ahead. My body tensed. I whispered, "Hello," and instantly regretted it when the sound echoed back to me. No response. I stepped slowly, shining my light around. There were no carts in motion, no sign of any person. The squeaking noise stopped, replaced by a deep hush that made my ears ring. I swallowed hard, feeling my throat go dry. I reached a spot where the tunnel widened into a larger chamber. The overhead timbers were spaced farther apart, giving me a slight sense of openness. In the middle of the space, I noticed a rusted metal hatch on the ground, probably leading to a lower level. A small ladder next to it was bent out of shape. I thought about exploring further, but the feelings of dread intensified. My skin broke out in goosebumps, and my stomach tightened. I decided that I'd gone far enough. I wanted to leave. As I turned to go back, I felt a sudden chill on the back of my neck, like cold air passing by. It raised the hairs on my arms. I spun around, shining my headlamp in wide arcs. For a split second, I thought I saw a flicker of light across the chamber, like someone else's flashlight beam. Then it vanished. My heart pounded. I took a few steps backward, pressing my back against the rough wall. I told myself it could have been a reflection, or maybe a glint off the metal. But then I heard a soft hum, almost like a person exhaling. My breath caught in my chest. The hum lasted a second or two, then faded. I turned, trying to figure out the direction. The acoustics made it tough to pinpoint. I decided it was time to go. My nerves were shot, and I didn't want to risk getting lost or trapped. I retraced my steps, walking briskly but trying not to stumble. My arms were tense. My flashlight shook in my hand. Each crunch of gravel under my feet sounded like thunder. I kept imagining something or someone right behind me. I glanced back often. The corridors seemed to stretch longer than before, as if the mine was shifting around me. My head felt light, and my chest felt tight, probably from stress. After a few minutes, I recognized a broken timber I had passed on the way in. Relief flickered in my mind. I followed that sign and kept moving toward the entrance. The dryness of the air irritated my throat, and I had to swallow repeatedly. At one point, the draft I'd felt earlier returned, blowing dust in my face. I coughed, covering my mouth with my sleeve. My eyes watered, and for a moment I had trouble seeing. I stopped, caught my breath, and blinked until my vision cleared. I powered through the last stretch, guided by the faint glow of daylight that started to appear ahead. The relief was immediate. I smelled fresh air mixing with the stale atmosphere of the tunnel. When I finally emerged outside, I realized how tense my muscles had been. I stepped onto the ground, took a few deep breaths, and let the warmth of the sun hit my face. My heartbeat was still racing. My shirt clung to me from sweat. I moved away from the entrance, over to my car parked a short distance away. My legs felt shaky, like I'd just finished a sprint. I set my backpack down, drank some water, and tried to calm myself. I kept glancing back at the dark tunnel mouth, half expecting to see movement in the shadows. I saw nothing. I heard nothing. Just the breeze through the trees near the parking area. After I recovered a bit, I got in my car and sat there for a few minutes, replaying everything in my mind. I wondered if I had imagined some of the noises. Maybe it was just the structure settling or random drafts. But I couldn't shake that sense of being watched or followed. My gut told me I had experienced something real, but I didn't have any proof. I drove away, determined to put some distance between myself and that place. As I headed back, I noticed my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, even though I was miles from the mine. My thoughts spun. I recalled the old stories about tragic accidents and trapped miners who supposedly haunt the tunnels. I didn't necessarily believe in ghosts, but I couldn't deny the heavy fear that gripped me down there. When I got home, I inspected the samples of coal dust and old rock fragments I had collected. They looked ordinary enough, just lumps of mineral and dust. But handling them reminded me of the claustrophobic passageways, the squeaking wheels, and that moan-like sound. I tried to shrug it off as leftover adrenaline. That night, I had trouble sleeping. My mind wouldn't stop replaying the flicker of light I thought I saw in the chamber. I also remembered that strange hum and how my stomach knotted at the time. In the following weeks, I told a couple of friends about my trip. They were both fascinated and alarmed. One friend said I should never go back there alone. Another suggested I contact a local historian who knows about the mine's background. I declined. I felt done with that place. I didn't want to open up more questions or feed my own anxiety. I had my experience, and it was enough to deter me from going back underground anytime soon. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I see old pictures of coal mines or hear people talk about abandoned sites. My chest tightens when I recall the darkness and the sense of not being alone. I remember how each breath tasted like metal and dust, and how every step seemed to echo with tension. Despite my interest in geology, I'm reluctant to explore any place that abandoned again. The Poconos might be beautiful on the surface, but underneath, in those dead tunnels, I felt only dread. I plan to keep my future explorations above ground. The memory of that whispered hum and the faint squeaking wheels will stay with me as a warning. I arrived in St. Augustine for a small historical architecture event. The city looked old and full of character, which interested me. I booked a room at a Victorian hotel that stood near some cobblestone streets. From the outside, it looked inviting. It had tall windows, intricate trim, and a large front porch. I walked inside, checked in at the front desk, and took the elevator to my room. I was on the third floor, in a cozy space with floral wallpaper and an antique dresser. I settled in, left my bag on the bed, and planned to explore the building, because I wanted to see more of its architectural details. On my first afternoon there, I explored the hallways. I noticed how the corridors had narrow arches and stained glass panels at certain corners. On the fourth floor, I saw a small door in the ceiling. It looked out of place. It wasn't marked, and it had a simple latch. The height of it suggested you'd need a step stool or ladder to open it. I found it odd because most hotels label their utility spaces, but this one was bare. My curiosity grew. I considered asking a staff member about it, but I decided to wait and see if I could figure it out on my own. I returned to the lobby and saw a maintenance worker. I asked him if there was an attic or storage area upstairs. He mumbled something about unused space. Then he excused himself and walked away. I took note of his reaction. It felt like he wanted to avoid the subject. I decided not to press him, but the idea of an attic still intrigued me. I left the hotel for a few hours, toured the older parts of town, and came back in the late afternoon. At the front desk, I asked to borrow a small stepladder, claiming I needed it to retrieve some items I had stored high in my closet. The clerk didn't ask many questions. He handed me a folding step stool. With that, I went back to the fourth floor, found that hidden door in the ceiling, and set the stool underneath it. I felt a slight nervousness because I knew I might get in trouble, but I also wanted to see what was up there. I climbed the stool and unlatched the door. It opened easily. A warm, heavy smell hit me right away. It felt like stale air that had been trapped for years. I lifted myself through the opening and found a dusty, cramped space with wooden beams and scattered boxes. I pulled my small flashlight from my pocket and switched it on. The beam revealed a network of rafters, a few old suitcases, and random bits of furniture. My heart beat faster from the excitement of entering a place not meant for guests. I crawled forward. There wasn't much headroom. I had to move slowly so I wouldn't bang my head on the beams. The dust made me cough. I noticed a row of mannequins along one wall. They wore Victorian dresses. The clothes looked faded and frayed at the edges. One of the mannequins had a face that was more detailed than the others. Its eyes looked hand-painted, and the expression felt unsettling. I got goosebumps on my arms. I took a closer look, shining the flashlight across the mannequins. They were arranged in a way that suggested someone had placed them there for storage, or maybe for some old display. I spotted a few wooden crates marked with old family initials. They were half open, revealing photo albums and bits of lace. The photos were black and white, showing people who once stayed at this hotel. In one picture, there was a party scene with couples dancing. The men wore suits, and the women wore dresses that looked similar to the outfits on the mannequins. I felt a chill. The albums seemed personal, full of smiling faces from another time. I set them back into the box. Suddenly, I heard a light step behind me. I turned my flashlight in that direction, but I saw only the darkness between the beams. I listened carefully. My pulse throbbed in my neck. The attic was quiet. I guessed it might have been the old beams settling, or maybe a small animal scurrying. I reminded myself this was an old building, but I felt uneasy. My breathing became faster. I moved further in, following a narrow passage formed by stacked crates. My flashlight fell on a row of framed portraits. Each showed a person in Victorian clothing. In every frame, the individuals looked formal, with serious expressions. One portrait showed a woman who wore the same dress as one of the mannequins. I aimed my flashlight at the mannequin again. Its face had the same features as the woman in the photo, the shape of the nose, the sharp cheekbones. It made me step back. My heart pounded harder. I tried to stay calm, but my nerves were on edge. I took a deep breath and decided to return to the entrance. I had seen enough. But as I stepped around a crate, I caught sight of something white on the floor. It was a slip of paper. It had a handwritten note that said, "Do not remain after dusk." My stomach knotted. I picked up the note. The handwriting was elegant, like old cursive script. I set it down on a crate. My mind raced. Why was there a warning like that? I turned toward the row of mannequins to head back. One of them looked as if it had shifted. It was only a small difference, maybe a tilt of the head or a slight turn in the angle. But I was almost certain it wasn't like that before. I shined the light again. All of them stood motionless. I had to force myself to move. My limbs felt shaky. I didn't want to panic, but my instincts told me to get out. I hurried along the same path I came, trying not to bump into the boxes. The attic felt hotter now, like there was no air circulation. My forehead was damp with sweat. I thought I heard a faint scraping sound behind me. I didn't stop to check. I reached the entrance, fumbled with the stepladder, and lowered myself through the opening. My arms felt weak, and I almost missed a step. I landed on the hallway floor, closed the door, and latched it. I stood there, breathing heavily. The hallway was quiet. The overhead lights seemed too bright after the darkness of the attic. I packed up the stool and carried it downstairs. I tried to act normal when I passed a housekeeper in the hallway. She glanced at me, and I wondered if she suspected anything, but she said nothing. Back in my room, I sat on the bed. My shirt stuck to my back from sweat. My mind replayed the details of what I saw, the mannequins, the photos, the note. I felt disturbed and a bit scared. I wondered if I should tell the front desk. Then I recalled the staff's reaction when I asked about the attic. I decided to keep quiet. I tried to distract myself by checking my phone, but my hand wouldn't stop trembling. I got ready for bed, but sleep didn't come easily that night. Around midnight, I woke to a strange noise in the corridor outside my door. It sounded like a soft thump, followed by a quiet shuffling. My heartbeat sped up. I turned on the bedside lamp. The noise stopped, and the hallway was silent again. I wondered if someone was up there in the attic, or if it was just the old building settling. My imagination ran wild. I put in earplugs to block out any further sounds. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning, I went to the hotel's restaurant for breakfast. I couldn't enjoy my meal. My stomach felt tight. I overheard another guest mention the architecture. I had the urge to ask them if they knew about the attic, but I held back. After breakfast, I had to attend a panel discussion for the event. I tried focusing on the speakers, but my thoughts kept drifting. I kept picturing those mannequins, especially the one with the detailed face. I remembered the note on the floor. Later, I approached the desk to return the stepladder. The same clerk asked if everything was okay. I lied and said yes. He didn't press the issue. I noticed he had a forced smile, like he was being polite but not entirely comfortable. As I walked away, I felt a chill run up my spine, remembering the warm, stale air of the attic. I spent most of that day avoiding the hotel, except for brief moments to grab items from my room. Each time I passed the elevator, I glanced at the button for the 4th floor, wondering if I should go back up. By early evening, I felt an urge to see if the door was still there, if it was still unlocked. I told myself it was a bad idea. My heart fluttered at the thought. My hands got sweaty. I knew I shouldn't go, but curiosity kept pulling at me. Right before sunset, I found myself on the 4th floor again. The corridor was empty. I looked at the ceiling and saw the same small door. I stood there just staring at it. I had no stool, so I couldn't reach it. I felt relief mixed with frustration. Then I heard footsteps at the other end of the hall, so I turned away and left. That night, I slept lightly. I dreamed of the attic. I saw the mannequins shifting in the dark, their eyes following me. I jolted awake twice, heart pounding. By dawn, I gave up on sleep and decided to check out a day early. I wasn't comfortable staying there any longer. I showered, packed my bag, and headed downstairs. The staff barely seemed to notice. The clerk asked why I was leaving, and I said I had personal matters. He just nodded. Outside, in the morning light, I glanced up at the top floors of the hotel. I imagined I saw movement behind one of the attic windows, but I couldn't be sure. I felt uneasy standing there, so I got in my car and drove away. I didn't look back. Months later, I still think about that attic. I recall the smell, the old crates, and the mannequins with lifelike faces. I remember that note warning people not to stay after dusk. I wonder if there's a deeper story behind those items, or if the place is just cluttered with old decorations. I don't plan on returning, though. The memory of that warm, stale air and the slight movements I saw are enough to keep me away. I shared a small version of my experience with a close friend, leaving out the more unnerving details. Even then, they said it sounded disturbing. I sometimes have nightmares about being stuck up there. I see the mannequins shifting when the flashlight goes out. I feel trapped with no way down. When I wake from those dreams, my heart pounds so hard I have to sit up and calm my breathing. I've stayed in other historic buildings since, and I try not to think about hidden attics or locked doors. But every now and then, I remember the heavy air, the wooden beams, the detailed faces on those mannequins, and the faint footsteps I couldn't explain. It's a memory that still makes my skin crawl. I'm not sure if the attic holds a secret, or if I simply walked into a storage room filled with odd items. Either way, the sense of being watched and the unsettling silence stick with me. Whenever I recall that place, I feel a tightness in my chest. I know I'll never go looking for that door again. I first learned about that abandoned hospital through whispered stories at my nursing school. People said it closed in the 1970s and never reopened, yet odd things supposedly happened at night. I felt drawn to it because I wanted to see if the rumors were true. Some classmates thought I was being reckless, but I felt curious. I had been studying patient care and wanted to understand how a place could hold on to its past so strongly. Around Billings, a few older residents claimed to hear voices coming from that building. I wanted to find out if they were right. One Saturday, I gathered my flashlight and drove out to the site. I parked on a dirt patch about a quarter-mile away from the property. The building stood alone, with broken windows and boarded-up doors. The shape looked like any small rural hospital, except it was lifeless. The sign near the entrance had faded letters. I could barely make out "hospital" on the worn metal. A chain-link fence surrounded the grounds, but it had large gaps. I slipped through an opening without difficulty. My nerves kicked in as soon as I was on the other side of the fence. I felt my stomach tighten. A chilly breeze hit me, and I remembered it was late autumn. The sun had gone down, so I clicked on my flashlight. It made a narrow beam of light that showed cracked sidewalks and bits of trash near the doors. I approached the front entrance and realized the door was stuck. I felt around the edges, then pushed at a loose board to the left of the main doors. It shifted, leaving enough space for me to slip inside. Inside, the first thing I noticed was the heavy smell of dust and mold. When I moved my flashlight around, I saw a small waiting area. There were about 6 chairs lined up against a wall. Their metal frames were rusted, and the fabric seats were torn. I exhaled and heard the echo of my own breath bounce off the walls. The place felt massive, even though I knew it wasn't a large hospital. I stood there for a moment. I listened for anything, but it was quiet. My heart was pounding. I walked over to the reception desk. The countertop had a thin layer of grime, and a few old forms were scattered around. I tried to read them, but the ink was too faded. My flashlight picked up stains on the floor that might have been water damage. I bent down to look more closely and heard a soft noise behind me. At first, I thought it was just the building settling. The roof had holes, and the wind might have moved something. But the noise sounded like a distant murmur, almost like people whispering in another room. I paused and stayed as still as possible. My chest felt tight, and my breathing got shallow. The sound continued for a couple of seconds. Then it faded. I told myself it was only my imagination, but curiosity pushed me on, so I headed deeper into the corridors. The hallway was long and narrow, with peeling paint on both sides. Some overhead lights were still there, but none worked. I aimed my flashlight at doors that lined the corridor. The old metal placards read, "Pediatrics, Emergency, and Quarantine." I passed each one, feeling a slight chill as I imagined what had happened in those rooms back when the place was operational. My footsteps echoed. The floor was covered in dirt and debris from fallen plaster. About halfway down that corridor, I found a door that was half open. I nudged it fully open with my foot. Inside, I saw a room with an overturned gurney and open cabinets. The shelves were empty, except for a few broken glass jars. The smell of mold was thicker here. My nose started to itch. A sudden sound came from the hallway, like quick footsteps on linoleum. I spun around, shining my flashlight, but saw no one. My heart was thudding in my chest. I took a step back into the corridor, feeling the adrenaline hit me. My skin felt clammy. I tried to control my breathing, but it only got worse when I thought about the footsteps. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe an animal had gotten inside. Raccoons or cats sometimes wander into abandoned places. But then I heard something else. A faint cry. It was a child's cry, high-pitched, echoing behind a wall. My grip tightened on the flashlight. My pulse was racing. I moved slowly in the direction of the sound. My mind was telling me to leave, but I also felt the need to confirm what I was hearing. I reached another intersection in the hallway. One sign pointed toward ICU. Another led to what looked like a staff lounge. The child's cry seemed to come from the ICU area. The hallway there was darker. The windows were all boarded. The only light came from a broken stained glass panel at the far end, letting in a bit of moonlight. As I walked, I saw old posters on the walls. They listed procedures for infection control and emergency steps. I tried to ignore them and focus on each step, each breath. Suddenly, the lights above me flickered. It startled me so much that I nearly dropped the flashlight. I looked up. The old fluorescent tubes sparked for a second. They came on in a weak flicker and then died again. In that brief moment, I thought I saw a silhouette, a person in a white coat, at the other end of the corridor. When the lights went off, the corridor was dark again. I hurried forward, shining my beam around, but found nothing. My palms were sweaty, and I could feel my shirt sticking to my back. I reached the ICU door. A sign said, "Intensive Care Unit," in faded letters. The door was wedged open. I slipped through. The place smelled stale, as if no one had been there in decades. There were more gurneys, some turned on their sides. I noticed a couple of IV stands pushed against a wall. Everything was coated in dust. My flashlight revealed a row of empty beds. Their sheets were gone, leaving only stained mattresses. I swallowed hard. The cry of the child had vanished. I heard another sound, though. It reminded me of squeaky wheels, like a rolling bed or cart. It came from behind a curtain in the corner. I pulled the curtain aside, but there was only an empty bed frame. My hands were shaking at this point. My heart hammered in my ears. I decided I had enough. Whatever curiosity I had was drowned out by the fear crawling up my spine. On my way back out, I spotted a tattered lab coat hanging on a door handle. It looked yellowed and thin, as if it had been there for ages. It swayed slightly, but there was no breeze. I felt goosebumps rise on my arms. I tried to keep my steps quick. I kept glancing over my shoulder because I sensed movement at the edge of my vision. But every time I turned, there was nothing. Then I heard a quiet clatter, like metal instruments bumping together. I passed by a room that might have been a small operating suite or procedure room. The door was locked from the inside. I didn't want to linger. I pressed on, determined to get back to the main hall. As I turned a corner, I stopped cold. The waiting area was now visible in the distance. I noticed flickers of movement. For a second, I believed I saw people walking among the chairs, dressed in old nurse uniforms. They appeared to be carrying supplies. I froze, not sure if my mind was playing tricks on me. I stood there, my breathing shallow. I aimed my flashlight at them, but there was no one. The chairs were still there, covered in dust. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my head. I continued toward the exit, stepping carefully to avoid broken glass on the floor. Once I got to the main entrance, I realized how silent it was outside. Through a large crack in the boarded window, I saw the faint glow of moonlight. The boards creaked as I pushed them aside. I slipped out, stumbling onto the front steps. My legs felt shaky, like I'd run a marathon. When I looked back, the building loomed over me. Its shadow seemed to stretch in all directions. The wind was calm, but I heard a faint sound of distant chatter from inside. It felt like the place was still occupied. I got to my car. I fumbled for my keys, dropped them, picked them up, and got into the driver's seat. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. I locked the doors and turned the ignition. The car started on the first try, but I hesitated before driving away. I looked at the hospital through the windshield. That's when I noticed a small light in one of the top-floor windows. It flickered and then went dark. I felt my body tense again. I finally reversed, turned around, and drove back to Billings. On the drive home, I kept replaying every sound I heard and every shape I thought I saw. My arms felt cold, and I realized I was gripping the steering wheel too tight. I tried to calm myself by focusing on the road. I wanted to tell someone about what happened, but I feared people might think I was exaggerating or making it up. By the time I reached the outskirts of town, I was too tired to do anything but go home. I parked outside my apartment and just sat there, staring at the dashboard, trying to process the entire experience. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that corridor with the flickering lights. I remembered the child's cry. I thought about the figure in the white coat. I kept turning over in bed, feeling my heart pound each time I recalled a door creaking or a whisper. My breathing would speed up. I had to sit up and remind myself I was safe in my own room. I even reached for my phone to consider calling a friend, but it was past midnight. I decided against it. The next day, I shared a bit of the story with a classmate, leaving out the more disturbing details. She looked concerned. She also seemed a little intrigued. She said, "That place is rumored to be haunted, but no one's gone in for years." I just nodded, unsure of how to confirm or deny anything. All I knew was what I experienced, the footsteps, the voices, the glimpses of motion. My friend suggested I talk to someone in town who might know more about the hospital's past. I said I might, but deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to get any deeper. For the next few nights, I had nightmares. They weren't long or elaborate, but they made me wake up sweating. I'd dream of walking down that same corridor. I'd hear the child crying, then I'd see a nurse at the far end calling me to follow. When I got close, she'd vanish. I'd stand alone in a dark room, feeling like something was behind me, but I never dared to turn around. Each time I'd wake up out of breath with my heart hammering. Over time, I tried to push those memories aside. I focused on my coursework and on my job at a local clinic. But that hospital kept popping into my thoughts. If I drove near that area, I felt a lump in my throat. I'd turn the radio up to distract myself. I avoided that country road at night. I still can't fully explain what happened. I can only say what I heard, saw, and felt. The place was too quiet at times, then filled with strange sounds at others. I can't forget the cry of that child. I remember the feeling of something brushing past me when I stood near the old gurneys, and that silhouette in a white coat at the end of the corridor. Did I imagine it, or was it really there? When the lights flickered, it felt real. I know what I saw, at least in that split second. I don't plan on returning. I satisfied my curiosity, and now I carry these memories. Each time I think about the hospital, my chest tightens. My shoulders tense up, and I recall the musty smell, the decaying furniture, and that unsettling sense that the building wasn't truly empty. Maybe something or someone is still there, moving in the darkness, repeating old routines. Or maybe it's just my mind playing tricks. Either way, I have no desire to find out. I got my answers, and that's enough for me. I first heard about the hidden crypt in Savannah from a stack of old library records. I was researching historical cemeteries for a personal project, hoping to uncover interesting facts for an article. The documents hinted at an underground chamber beyond the main tombs, closed off to the public. One entry mentioned a rusted gate behind a mausoleum, leading down a flight of stairs few people had ever seen. The reference was vague, but it stuck in my mind. I had visited several cemeteries in Savannah, but I never found anything as secretive as that. This lead felt important. I decided to investigate. I packed a flashlight, extra batteries, a small bottle of water, and a cheap handheld camera. I chose a weekday night for better privacy. The main gates of the cemetery would close in the evening, so I arrived just before sunset. I parked a few blocks away and walked to the side of the cemetery wall. A section of the wall was short enough for me to climb. I tossed my backpack over, then hoisted myself up and dropped down on the other side. My landing was clumsy, but I stayed on my feet. The cemetery spread out before me in rows of marble and granite markers, some with carved angels and others with faded inscriptions. The evening light cast long shadows across the tombstones. Moss hung from crooked trees, and a light breeze moved through the branches. I felt my stomach tighten. This was one of the older cemeteries in Savannah. People said it had a history of unrecorded burials and hidden vaults. I kept that in mind as I followed a worn path toward the center. The main walkway had tall statues and elaborate mausoleums. Most were from the 1800s, though some were older. I pretended to be a normal visitor, just in case a caretaker appeared. Nobody did. I passed a large mausoleum with iron gates. The name on it was half erased by time. According to the records, I needed to go behind this building. I circled around the structure, pushing past a layer of vines. The earth felt softer there, and the smell of damp soil filled the air. Behind the mausoleum, I found a narrow set of stone stairs leading underground. A rusted gate blocked the entrance. A heavy chain wrapped around the bars. I tugged on it, and the metal rattled. The lock was old. I pulled out a small pry bar from my backpack. After a few attempts, the lock gave with a sharp snap. I felt my heart pound as I shoved the gate open. The hinges screeched in protest. My hands were already clammy. I flicked on my flashlight and aimed it down the stairs. The steps descended into darkness, and the smell of moisture and old earth became stronger. I could see faint carvings on the walls. I couldn't make out details, but they resembled symbols or letters. My chest tightened with each step. A drip of water echoed in the distance, making me twitch. The stone walls seemed to close in, and the air felt thicker as I went deeper. My flashlight beam revealed a narrow corridor at the bottom. I stepped onto a dirt floor that sloped slightly. The corridor stretched forward. Sections of the walls had carved faces or animal shapes. Some looked worn away, but others were clear enough to see eyes and mouths. My pulse thudded. I had seen pictures of old crypt art, but never this strange. It felt more ominous than typical religious carvings. I forced myself to keep moving, shining my light carefully so I wouldn't trip. Small roots stuck out from the ceiling, and I felt a drip of water strike my shoulder. I passed several side alcoves, each closed off by iron bars. Some were stacked with old wooden boxes that might have been coffins. Others appeared empty. The bars were rusted, and some doorways had partial collapse, blocking entry. I paused to check if any of these alcoves matched the crypt I read about in the records. None did. I kept following the main corridor. As I rounded a corner, I saw a faint glow ahead, flickering like candlelight. My throat tightened. I flipped off my flashlight and stood still. My eyes adjusted to the dimness. Yes, there was definitely a soft, pale light coming from around the next bend. I heard a low, murmured sound, possibly voices. My chest felt tight. I swallowed hard, not sure if I should turn back or keep going. Curiosity pushed me forward. I moved as quietly as I could, placing each step carefully to avoid loose stones. The corridor led to a larger chamber, supported by stone pillars. A group of people stood there, dressed in dark robes with hoods, at least 4 or 5 of them. They surrounded a small altar covered in candles. A large, old book lay open on the altar, its pages yellowed. One person read in a low voice, speaking words I couldn't make out. The rest listened or occasionally chanted along. My heart pounded so hard I worried they would hear it. My hands shook, and my mouth felt dry. I tried to remain hidden in the shadows near the corridor entrance. I kept my flashlight off, relying on their candlelight. I watched them for a moment, uncertain what I was witnessing. It looked like some ritual. They flipped a page in the book, spoke a few lines, then lifted their hands. A gust of air passed through the chamber, almost snuffing out the candles. I had to stifle a gasp when the flame wavered. I had no idea where that sudden breeze came from. My skin crawled with goosebumps. Then one figure turned halfway toward me, as if sensing something. I ducked behind a pillar, my chest tightening. I didn't see the person's face, only the outline of the hood. The chanting paused. Silence filled the chamber. I held my breath, worried they had spotted me. My heart raced. After a few seconds, the chanting resumed, and I heard the rustle of robes. I peeked around again, more slowly this time. They were still focused on the altar, flipping another page in the book. One of them raised a small bowl, and I saw a faint red liquid inside, but I couldn't tell what it was. The voice continued the chant, lower now. I knew I was out of my depth. I felt a strong urge to escape before they finished their ritual and discovered me. Sweat formed on my forehead. I forced myself to inch backward, toward the corridor that led me here. I moved slowly, pressing my back against the cold stone. I kept my eyes on the robed group until I was around the corner. Once out of sight, I turned and began tiptoeing away. My foot slipped on a loose rock, sending a loud clatter echoing through the corridor. My stomach lurched, and I froze. The chanting stopped again. I heard quick footsteps, like they were checking what caused the noise. I didn't wait. I bolted, flicking on my flashlight to avoid smashing into a wall. My heart pounded as I sprinted down the passage, not caring about the racket I made. Behind me, I heard voices shouting, their tone urgent. I glanced back once and saw a flicker of candlelight. My lungs burned as I ran, trying to recall the route back. I passed the row of barred alcoves, the hallway with the face carvings, everything a blur in my peripheral vision. My flashlight beam jerked around, lighting up uneven ground and broken stones. Eventually, I spotted the stairs leading up. I darted to them, missing the bottom step and crashing hard onto my knee. Pain shot through my leg, but I scrambled up, ignoring the throbbing. I heard distant footsteps behind me, echoing with my own. The corridor amplified every sound, making it feel like they were right on my heels. I pushed forward, half running, half crawling up the steps. At the top, I saw the open gate. I burst out into the cemetery, gulping fresh night air. The sky was dark now, the stars hidden behind thick clouds. I slammed the gate shut behind me, though I had broken the lock earlier. It wouldn't do much to stop them. I stumbled around the mausoleum, wincing with each step on my sore knee. I needed to leave fast, before anyone caught up to me. I weaved between headstones, my flashlight off to avoid drawing attention. My eyes adjusted to the dim starlight. A few times I heard faint voices or shuffling footsteps. I wasn't sure if it was just my imagination or actual pursuit. My pulse pounded in my ears. I reached the cemetery wall where I had climbed over. I tossed my backpack onto the top and pulled myself up, hissing in pain as my knee complained. I rolled over and dropped down on the other side, landing hard on my feet. I made it to my car in a couple of minutes, scanning the shadows behind me. Nobody emerged from the cemetery. I yanked the door open, jumped in, and locked it. My hands were still shaking as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life and I sped away, the tires skidding on the empty street. My chest heaved as I tried to calm down. My knee throbbed and sweat soaked my shirt. Once I was a few blocks away, I pulled over, trying to process what had happened. My mind raced with images of the robed group, the old book, the chanting, and that random gust of air around their candles. I still heard the echo of their voices in my head. My breathing was ragged and my knee stung, but I felt relieved to be out of there. A part of me worried about what would have happened if they caught me. I didn't have any pictures or recordings. I hadn't dared to take a photo once I saw them. It was too risky. So I only had my memory of the crypt and the robed figures performing their ritual. As I drove back to my hotel, I considered whether to call the authorities or tell someone about it. But what would I say? That I trespassed in a cemetery and saw a group chanting in a hidden crypt? They could have been harmless enthusiasts, or they could have been something worse. I had no proof. The next morning, I woke up with a stiff knee and a swirling sense of dread. I checked local news, half expecting a report of a break-in at the cemetery. I found nothing. That didn't surprise me. I decided not to share too many details with my colleagues. I wrote down my account in my journal, describing every step, including the strange carvings on the walls. Then I locked the journal away. Sometimes I lie awake at night, recalling the flicker of candlelight and the hush before the chanting started. I remember the heaviness in the air and the feeling that something in that crypt was older and darker than just local superstition. I'll probably never go back there. If someone else wants to explore that hidden chamber, they can. I've seen enough. My curiosity about the old records turned into a real, tangible fear. I'm convinced there's more to Savannah's cemeteries than just decorative tombstones and historical intrigue. I can live without knowing the full story of that crypt. As for the robed people, I have no idea what they were doing or why. The memory of their unified voices, the large ancient book, and the sudden breeze remains vivid in my mind. I suspect they might return to that place whenever they want, performing rituals under the city's quiet streets. I won't stand in their way. I'm content to move on, leaving that secret crypt to whatever hidden purposes it serves. I arrived in Concord on a gray afternoon, carrying a backpack with my camera, notebook, and a small flashlight. I had a permit from a distant relative of the old mansion's owner, allowing me to enter the property to catalog the remaining clocks. I'm a local historian by trade, and I had heard rumors for years about this house of clocks. People said every wall was covered in timepieces that no longer worked. They also said the place caught fire once, charring half the rooms, yet the clocks stayed intact. I thought it was an exaggeration, but I was curious enough to find out. I parked my car on a narrow gravel road that led to the mansion's front gate. The gate was locked, but my borrowed key turned the stiff padlock without too much trouble. The iron squeaked as I swung it open. The mansion rose at the end of a weed-filled driveway. Its exterior was old, with peeling paint and dark stains around the upper windows. I noticed one entire section looked scorched, with blackened wood near the roof. The sun was hidden behind clouds, and a slight breeze made the tall grass ripple around me. I stepped up to the wide front door. It had a large brass knocker shaped like an ornate clock face. I used my key to unlock it, and the door creaked as it swung inward. A rush of musty air hit me. I smelled smoke residue, old wood, and something like stale polish. I flicked on my flashlight and found a light switch on the wall. I tried it, but nothing happened. The electricity must have been cut off years ago. I expected that. My contact told me there was no functioning power inside. The foyer had a high ceiling. A crystal chandelier hung overhead, its pieces dull with dust. Along the walls, I saw them immediately, clocks of different sizes and shapes. Some were tall grandfather clocks with wooden casings. Others were small mantel clocks perched on shelves. Every single one was frozen at a different time. I took a few steps forward, shining my light around. I heard a faint ticking noise for a moment, then silence. I started taking pictures and scribbling notes. I wanted to record each clock's type and any visible inscriptions or maker marks. Many had soot stains or burn marks. Their glass fronts were smudged. As I moved down a hall, I saw more clocks in every niche and on every table. Some had been knocked over, lying on the floor in pieces. Each one showed a different hour, minute, or second, as if they'd all stopped at random moments in the past. A wide staircase led to the second floor. The railing had a few charred spots, and the steps creaked loudly under my weight. I felt a slight chill in the air, possibly from the draft through broken windows. At the top of the stairs, a large hallway stretched in two directions. To the left, I saw open doors leading to rooms with blackened walls. To the right, the corridor seemed less damaged. I decided to head right first, since it seemed safer. As I walked, my flashlight beam revealed more clocks. There was almost no bare wall space, Some clocks had pendulums, others had wind-up keys, and a few had ornate faces with faded Roman numerals. I paused beside one large grandfather clock to examine its engravings. It read, Paris, 1887. While I studied it, I heard a single tick from inside. My heart jumped. I tapped the glass, but everything appeared still. The pendulum was motionless. I shrugged it off and continued. I entered what looked like a living room or drawing room. Furniture lay under dusty sheets, and the carpet was stained. On one wall, an entire set of smaller clocks formed a collage. I photographed them. Then, out of nowhere, one clock let out a soft chime. I froze, waiting to see if more would follow. Nothing did. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. My mind told me it was just a leftover mechanism triggered by me bumping the floor, but I hadn't touched anything. I decided to keep moving. I found a narrow passageway that led to a study. The air smelled stronger of smoke there, and I saw blackened beams overhead. The fire must have been intense in this area. On a large desk sat an oversized pocket watch in a glass display case. Its lid melted and warped. I crouched down to look at the watch face. It pointed to 2:47, the second hand stuck between two markers. I grabbed my notebook and copied the details. Then I heard a loud tock near my shoulder. I nearly dropped my pen. When I turned, I saw a pendulum clock on a shelf behind me, pendulum hanging motionless. It sounded again, tock, even though the mechanism showed no life. My pulse sped up. I swallowed, forcing myself to remain calm. Stepping back into the hallway, I noticed the silence around me felt heavy. No wind, no birds outside, and no ticking from any clocks. It was as if time had paused inside this house. I walked toward the scorched section. The floorboards felt weaker under my feet, so I moved carefully. The damage was worse here. Walls blackened, wallpaper peeling in strips, and clocks fallen off nails. Some lay broken on the ground. I knelt to check one that had its gears exposed. The metal looked warped from heat. As I was about to stand up, I heard a metallic clang from upstairs. I realized there must be a third floor. My heart beat faster. I hadn't planned on going higher if the fire damage was severe, but curiosity tugged at me. I crept along the corridor until I spotted another staircase at the end. This one was narrower and looked more fragile, missing a handrail in some places. I tested each step with my foot before putting my weight on it. The boards groaned, but they held. The third floor was darker. Most of the windows here were boarded up. My flashlight revealed more clocks, some lying sideways on the floor. The entire corridor had a faint smell of ash and old flowers, like potpourri that had been left too long. I passed several closed doors. I tried the first one, but it was locked or stuck. The second opened into a small bedroom. The bed frame was broken, and there were two large grandfather clocks facing each other across the room. Their faces were cracked. One read 9:15, the other 11:02. A strange hush filled the space. I turned to leave, and all of a sudden, both clocks chimed at once. The sound was jarring and out of sync. One struck what must have been 9 chimes, the other struck 11. My flashlight flickered as they rang, making my chest tighten. The moment they finished, everything went silent again. I stood there, breathing hard, trying to steady my hands. I'd never seen clocks with no apparent power still able to chime. I felt an urge to get out of the house, but part of me still wanted more proof of these strange happenings. I stepped back into the corridor. I caught sight of a faint glow under a door at the far end. It didn't look like electric light, more like a soft, flickering orange. It might have been sunlight leaking through a gap in the boards, but I couldn't be sure. I approached carefully, my nerves on edge. The door opened with a quiet push. Inside, I saw a long room stacked with boxes and old furniture. At the back, there was a tall floor clock with part of its face missing. I saw a glow coming from behind it, like a candle flame. I moved closer, heart pounding, shining my flashlight behind the clock. There was nothing there, no candle. The glow vanished. I heard a single tick, then silence. That was enough. My nerves felt shot. I turned around and made my way back downstairs, trying not to trip on debris or broken boards. On the second floor, a new sound erupted. Multiple clocks started ticking at once, each out of phase with the others. I raced toward the main staircase as the ticking got louder. It sounded like dozens of separate beats. My throat felt dry, and my legs moved on pure adrenaline. When I reached the bottom, the foyer lights, previously dead, flickered for a second, then went dark again. The chandelier overhead rattled. I looked up in alarm, expecting it to fall, but it stayed in place. The ticking noise faded as quickly as it began, leaving my ears ringing from the sudden silence. I didn't wait around. I grabbed the door handle, flung it open, and burst outside into the overcast daylight. The shift from the mansion's thick stillness to the open air made my head spin. I locked the door behind me with shaking hands, then leaned against it, breathing fast. My heart hammered. I stood there for a moment, scanning the yard. Everything looked normal. The breeze swayed the tall grass. A distant bird cawed. It felt surreal after what I'd just experienced. I walked down the driveway, glancing over my shoulder at the house. From the outside, it looked like any old burned mansion. The windows showed no sign of movement. The place sat quietly in the gray afternoon. When I reached my car, I fumbled with my keys, almost dropping them in the dirt. I glanced at the upper floors. For a split second, I thought I saw a dark figure in one window, but I couldn't be sure. I climbed into my car and started the engine, my hands still trembling. I spent a while sitting there, letting my breathing return to normal. My phone buzzed with a message from the relative who owned the place, asking if I was all right. I just replied, "All good, heading home." But inside, I felt unsettled. I'd entered a house full of clocks that shouldn't work, yet some of them chimed and ticked. I had the photos in my camera and the notes in my notebook. None of that would fully explain the sounds I heard. I wasn't sure I even wanted to try. I drove away, leaving the mansion behind. The tension in my shoulders eased a little once I hit the main road. Even now, I can recall how the air felt inside that house, heavy, charged with something I can't name. I sometimes wake up remembering the sudden chiming of those broken clocks, or the quick ticking that faded into silence. People ask if I found any interesting antiques in Concord, and I usually give a polite nod. I don't share the details. It's enough that I know what I witnessed in that house. The rumor about the clocks might be real. Each one might carry its own trapped moment in time, waiting for someone to walk by and stir it back to life. I told the owner's relative that the mansion needs more than restoration. It needs someone prepared to deal with clocks that won't stay silent. He laughed off my concerns, talking only about potential resale value. I didn't argue. I had no desire to set foot inside again. My part was done. If someone else wants to record those chaotic chimes, they can have at it. I prefer to keep my distance, letting that house remain a mystery. My memories of the frozen clock faces and unexpected noises are enough to convince me that not all broken mechanisms stay broken. In that place, time still moves in unpredictable bursts, echoing through a house that refuses to let its clocks die. I drove into Sacramento late in the afternoon, feeling a nervous energy in my stomach. I had arranged to meet a friend who had a key to an abandoned warehouse in the industrial sector. The place had once been a metalworking facility, but it went bankrupt years ago. Now it stood empty, except for rumors of strange noises at night, clanking metal, voices, even the hum of old machinery. I'm an audio engineer, and I'd volunteered to record anything unusual for a documentary I was working on. I wanted raw evidence of so-called acoustic echoes in abandoned sites. I thought it would be a routine job, just me and my equipment, capturing ambient sounds. The area around the warehouse was quiet. A few chain-link fences separated junkyards from the main road. I saw piles of scrap metal, old shipping containers, and broken-down vehicles scattered in vacant lots. My friend waited by a rusty gate. She handed me a ring of keys and wished me luck, saying she'd stay outside. She admitted she didn't want to step foot inside the building. Something about the place unsettled her. I shrugged it off and walked through the gate alone, heading toward a massive metal door. I unlocked the padlock. The door groaned as I pulled it open, revealing total darkness inside. A stale smell hit me, dust, mildew, and a hint of old oil or grease. I flicked on my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the interior. The floor was concrete, with cracks and puddles where rain had leaked in over time. Broken tools, half buried in debris, lay scattered around. The roof had a few holes, letting in thin shafts of daylight. I stepped forward, boots crunching on loose gravel. My plan was simple. I'd set up my recording equipment at various spots around the warehouse and let it run. Then I'd explore each corner and corridor, listening for anything out of the ordinary. I'd done this at other locations without incident, but as soon as I entered this space, I felt a weird tension in my shoulders. The air seemed heavier than usual. I chalked it up to nerves and kept going. I set down a portable recorder near what looked like an old assembly line. Rusted conveyor belts ran along one side, their gears locked in place from years of neglect. I pressed the record button, and the little LED light glowed red. Then I walked farther, shining my flashlight on stacks of pallets and old crates. Some had labels indicating metal parts, others had no markings. I saw a flicker of movement near a corner, but it was probably just my beam catching a reflection off metal. I continued, looking for a good spot to place a second recorder. I found a row of huge metal presses in a section of the warehouse that felt colder. My arms prickled with goosebumps as I stepped there. I could see my breath in front of me, which was odd because outside it hadn't been that cold. I set the recorder on a fallen beam and switched it on. I spoke aloud for my notes. Recorder 2, near old presses. Interior temperature feels lower here. Time is 5:21 p.m. Then I heard a metallic clang echo behind me. I spun around, flashlight raised. Nothing moved. The clang was quick, like a hammer hitting a pipe. I waited, heart thumping, but the noise didn't repeat. I figured maybe something had shifted or fallen on its own. Abandoned buildings do that sometimes. I walked through a large doorway into the next section of the warehouse. My flashlight revealed more clutter, workbenches, rusted shelves, boxes. A thick layer of dust coated everything. I decided to set a third recorder on one of the benches to capture any stray sounds. As I placed it, I noticed footprints in the dust on the floor. They didn't look recent, but they definitely weren't mine. They led toward a stairwell that went up to a small office area overlooking the main floor. I felt a knot form in my stomach, but I tried to stay calm. I followed the footprints, stepping carefully. The stairs creaked, and the metal railing felt shaky. At the top, I found a small office with shattered windows. I could see the entire factory floor from here. The late afternoon light came through a few broken skylights, creating a pattern on the debris below. I paused to look for any sign of movement. Nothing. Then I heard a faint humming noise, like a power transformer, except I knew there was no electricity. It lasted a few seconds, then cut off. I whispered to myself, "That's weird," and I set up a small shotgun microphone on the windowsill, aiming it at the floor below. I wanted to capture that humming sound if it returned. My heart was still beating fast, but I tried to stay focused on the technical aspects of my task. I stepped back toward the stairs, and the microphone suddenly picked up a burst of static. I heard it through my headphones, like someone whispering behind the static. My pulse jumped. I froze, listening. The whisper faded, replaced by silence. I clenched my teeth, trying to steady my breathing. I headed back down. The steps groaned under my weight. As soon as I reached the bottom, I heard a loud crash. It sounded like a metal tool falling off a table. I jogged toward the noise, flashlight beams shaking. I reached a corner where a long table stood stacked with rusted wrenches and other equipment. A wrench lay on the floor, still vibrating from impact. My chest tightened. Something or someone must have knocked it off, but I was alone. I bent down to pick up the wrench, and a sudden flicker of light appeared overhead. It was a lone lamp fixture swinging from the ceiling, turning on and off rapidly. I knew there shouldn't be electricity in the building. My heartbeat thundered. The flicker revealed shifting shadows along the walls, shapes that looked like people working at machines. I backed away, swallowing hard. My flashlight flickered too, then stabilized. The overhead lamp went dark again, leaving me in near blackness except for my flashlight beam. I heard faint voices, like distant conversations. Someone mentioning production quotas, another person complaining about a deadline. It sounded like muffled chatter from a busy workday. I stood still, adrenaline surging. The voices came from all around, echoing as if inside a large, active factory. Then they stopped, replaced by silence so deep I could hear my own heart pounding. I decided I needed to check my recorders to see if they had captured anything. I returned to the first one near the assembly line, lifting it off the floor. The red light was still on. I pressed the playback button, headphones on, listening. At first I heard my own footsteps, then a faint mechanical sound, like gears turning. My scalp tingled. I heard soft voices too, though I couldn't make out words. I paused the playback, feeling a wave of unease wash over me. I grabbed the recorder under my arm and hurried to the second recorder near the presses. The temperature in that section felt even colder. I could see my breath. The recorder's battery indicator blinked red, nearly drained. Odd, since I'd put fresh batteries in it earlier. I hit playback. Static hissed. Then a rhythmic clang repeated. My heart skipped a beat. It sounded like a hammer striking metal in a steady pattern. I heard it maybe 3 times, then silence. I fast-forwarded. Another burst of static. A faint voice said something that sounded like, "Watch your step," followed by more static. My hands shook. Suddenly a shadow moved across my peripheral vision. I spun around, shining the flashlight. I saw a figure, just for a second, darting behind a large machine. I shouted, "Hello? Who's there?" My voice echoed. No answer. I realized I was trembling. I debated leaving right then, but I felt compelled to gather as much evidence as possible. I forced myself toward the third recorder on the workbench. As I neared it, I heard the low hum again, the one from earlier. It built up in intensity, making my ears ring. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. It felt like the entire building was vibrating. Then, with a pop, the sound stopped. I picked up the recorder, noticing my microphone cable was coiled in a strange pattern I hadn't left it in. That gave me a jolt of panic. Someone or something had moved it. I checked the device. It was still running. I tapped the playback button and heard faint moaning, like metal under stress. My own voice wasn't on it yet. Then I heard footsteps. They were heavy, approaching the microphone, then retreating. My chest felt tight. At that moment, the overhead lamp in this section flickered on, revealing the entire work area. I saw silhouettes of people where the benches stood. They were dark outlines, each one at a station, their heads bent as if focusing on a task. My flashlight fell from my hand, clattering to the floor. I stood there, paralyzed, as the silhouettes shifted and moved. Then the lamp buzzed and cut off, plunging the room back into darkness. My heart raced like I'd just sprinted a mile. I picked up my flashlight with shaking hands, scanning the area. Nothing, just an empty workbench. I ran toward the main door, hugging my recorders tight. The crunch of debris underfoot sounded deafening. My breath came in short gasps. In the dim circle of my flashlight, I saw the exit ahead. I practically threw myself at it, fumbling with the locks. The metal door screeched as I yanked it open. I stumbled outside into the evening light, my friend rushing over from her car. I was drenched in sweat, panting. She asked, "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I stared at her, speechless for a moment. Then I nodded, unable to find words to describe what had happened. My hands shook as I locked the door behind me. I could still feel the pressure in my ears from that hum. I loaded my gear into my trunk and slid into my driver's seat, heart still pounding. Back at my place later, I played the recordings on my computer. They were full of eerie mechanical noises, faint voices, and unexplained static bursts. I heard echoes of machines that should have been offline for years. I replayed them multiple times, but it just made me more uneasy. The next day, I showed a few clips to my documentary partner. She listened with wide eyes, then said she had no explanation. I still think about that night sometimes. It left me with a deep respect for whatever traces remain in old buildings. I can't fully explain the illusions of machines, the ghostly silhouettes of workers, or the flickering lights that had no power source. All I know is that I walked into that warehouse expecting a simple recording session. Instead, I left convinced that the past can linger in places we abandon. And I have the audio to prove it. I haven't set foot there again. I gave my friend the keys back and told her I was done. She just nodded like she already knew. Sometimes it's better to leave such places to their own endless echoes. I had grown up in Salem hearing the usual stories about witches and tourists flocking to the famous sites. But the Lake of the Sisters was different. Locals mentioned it in hushed tones, saying 2 sisters, accused of witchcraft, drowned there centuries ago. Some said you could hear them at night. Others rolled their eyes and dismissed it as a silly tale. I wanted to find out for myself. I'm the kind of person who needs direct experience. So I packed a small tent, some food, and a flashlight, and I drove out to the secluded area where the lake sits, far from the main roads. When I arrived, it was late afternoon. The sun was low, turning the sky an orange-pink color. I parked on a narrow dirt path just off an unmarked road. Trees surrounded everything, thick and tall, blocking most of the sunlight. I followed a faint trail, crunching fallen leaves under my boots, until I reached a small clearing by the water. The lake looked calm, with only a soft ripple at the surface. The air felt cool, and I smelled damp earth mixed with the scent of pine. It seemed peaceful enough, not at all like a haunted place. I found a flat spot near the edge of the tree line and set up my tent. While I hammered the stakes into the ground, I kept glancing at the water. A gentle breeze created small waves near the shore. I didn't see anything unusual, but I felt a slight tension in my stomach. I told myself it was just the excitement of being alone in a place with a dark legend. After finishing the tent, I gathered some firewood from the surrounding area. I had planned to make a small campfire later, once darkness settled in. I sat down on a log, opened a bottle of water, and ate a sandwich. The sky was getting darker, and the sounds of birds started to fade. I checked my phone. No signal. That didn't surprise me. The nearest cell tower was probably miles away. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked at the lake. The reflection of the moon, still faint, hovered on the surface. I couldn't see it fully yet because the sun hadn't completely disappeared. My mind wandered to the stories I had heard, people claiming they heard voices calling for help, or saw the shapes of two women floating near the middle of the lake. Most folks said it was nonsense, but my friend had once mentioned he heard strange whispers when he camped here. I decided to pass the time by exploring the shoreline. I grabbed my flashlight in case it got dark quickly. I walked along the edge of the water, noticing how clear it was near the bank. I could see small fish darting around. I saw old logs half submerged, moss growing on them. Everything felt ordinary. Then, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the wind picked up. I heard it rustling through the trees. The air turned colder. My skin broke out in goosebumps, and I realized the temperature had dropped faster than I expected. I went back to my campsite and started a small fire with the wood I had collected. The flames crackled, giving me a sense of comfort. The light danced on the nearby trees. I sat on the log again, holding my hands out toward the heat. I noticed the moon was now visible overhead, round and bright, casting a pale glow on the water. The lake looked like a mirror, except for occasional ripples that disturbed the surface. That's when I heard the first sound. It was a soft, drawn-out whisper, like someone exhaling a single word I couldn't make out. I froze, scanning the area with my flashlight. I didn't see anyone near the tree line, and there were no houses around. My heart pounded a little harder. I tried to dismiss it as the wind, but I noticed my fire flickered oddly, like a gust had hit it. Yet I felt no breeze at that moment. I swallowed and stood up, stepping away from the fire. I aimed my flashlight toward the water. It reflected back at me, showing a smooth surface with the moon hanging above it. My breath caught in my throat when I thought I saw something move across the far side of the lake. It could have been a branch floating, but the shape was too slim and upright for a piece of wood. It vanished behind a patch of reeds. I felt my pulse quicken. The night grew quieter. The usual chorus of crickets sounded distant, like they had backed away from this area. The wind no longer blew, and the trees seemed still. I walked closer to the water, shining my flashlight across it. I saw only the moon's reflection and a few stray bits of debris. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard a faint sound, almost like someone humming a lullaby. My stomach clenched. I spun around, expecting to see a person. Nobody stood there. I could still see my small fire, about 20 yards away, glowing softly. I whispered, "Hello?" My own voice made me jump. No answer, just that single note of humming that faded almost immediately. My body tensed, and my breathing became shallow. I turned back toward the water. Now, the surface rippled more than before. I could hear a gentle splash. My flashlight caught a swirl of water near the center of the lake, as if something had stirred it. I saw small waves fan out, then settle. My heart pounded. I resisted the urge to run back to my tent. I forced myself to stand at the shoreline. The moonlight helped me see a little better. That's when I noticed two faint shapes in the center of the lake, half floating. They looked like two figures lying on their backs, arms stretched out. For a moment, I convinced myself it was just driftwood, but the shapes looked too much like people. My chest tightened, and my hands shook. I aimed the flashlight at them. The beam wasn't strong enough to fully illuminate that distance, but I saw a pale outline. Then, just as quickly, the shapes sank. The water went still again. My throat felt dry. I took a few steps back, my heart hammering. I returned to my fire, trying to think logically. Maybe I had spooked myself, but I couldn't ignore what I had seen. I thought about packing up and leaving, yet part of me wanted to stay to confirm the legend. I sat by the fire, rubbing my arms for warmth. The flames felt good, but the light only reached a small radius around me. Beyond that, everything was pitch black. Each little snap from the fire made me jumpy. I stared at the lake, waiting for something else to happen. Around midnight, I started dozing off despite my nerves. Then a sharp gust of wind rattled me awake. The wind came from the direction of the lake, and it blew through the trees in a sudden rush. My fire guttered, nearly going out. As I grabbed a spare piece of wood to toss onto the embers, I heard splashing water. It was louder this time, like someone kicking or thrashing at the surface. I leaped up, shining my flashlight toward the sound. I could see ripples near the shore, less than 20 feet from where I stood. My heart lurched. I walked slowly toward the water, my legs trembling. At the edge, I saw a swirl of bubbles and foam, as if someone had just sunk below the surface. The hair on my arms stood up. Then, in the reflection of the moonlight, I glimpsed two pale hands briefly breaking the surface before sliding back under. My chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe. I stumbled backward, almost falling into the shallows. My mind screamed to run, but I stood there stunned. The water settled again. The lake returned to a glossy, moonlit surface. My mouth felt too dry to swallow. I forced out a breath, then spoke aloud, "Who's there?" I didn't expect an answer. None came, but a soft, plaintive voice whispered a single word that sounded like "sister." It echoed across the water, or maybe in my head. Either way, I felt chills spread through my body. The voice sounded sad and desperate. I rushed back to my fire, stumbling on tree roots in the dark. My thoughts were a mess. I had witnessed something that felt impossible. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it might have been an animal or some random lake phenomenon. But I couldn't ignore the shape of those hands or the voice I heard. I started packing my gear in a hurry. My fingers shook so badly I fumbled with the tent poles. I managed to stuff everything into my car, leaving the tent stakes in the ground. I just wanted to leave. Before driving off, I glanced one last time at the lake. It looked calm again, reflecting the moon. I felt tears welling up because the entire experience overwhelmed me. I couldn't shake the feeling that two drowned spirits were still out there, reliving their final moments. I hopped into my car, turned on the engine, and cranked the heater to calm my shivering. I backed up, nearly hitting a stump, and then sped off down the dirt path. My headlights bounced over the uneven ground, and dust rose behind me. I got back to the main road, heart still racing. Once I reached a patch of better-lit highway, I stopped the car and pulled over. I tried to slow my breathing. I checked my phone again, still no signal. I just sat there, letting my mind catch up. My thoughts drifted to the stories of the two sisters who supposedly drowned while fleeing accusations. People said they tried to hide in the thick woods, but ended up sinking in the marshy section of the lake. Whether or not that was the full truth, I didn't doubt something haunted that water. When I eventually returned to my apartment, I spent the rest of the night wide awake, replaying each moment. The shapes in the center of the lake, the pale hands, the whispered sister, and the odd gusts of wind. My whole body felt tense, and my stomach twisted every time I recalled that final splash. I told a few friends about it later, but most of them chalked it up to me scaring myself in a lonely spot. One or two listened intently, eyes wide, and said they had heard similar tales. They admitted they wouldn't go near the Lake of the Sisters at night. I haven't gone back since. Whenever I drive past Salem's outskirts, I feel a twinge of unease if I pass any large body of water. Even if it's broad daylight, the memory rushes back. I remember the sorrowful tone of that voice, the moonlight reflecting on the surface, and those two shapes slipping away. That single word, sister, echoes in my mind, and I wonder if they were asking for help or just replaying their final plea. Either way, I'm convinced something lingers in that water, and I have no desire to be near it again after dark. I never told my family the full truth. They worry enough already, and they'd probably forbid me from doing any more late-night investigations. I'm still curious about unexplained places, but the Lake of the Sisters taught me the difference between hearing a legend and living it. My hands still shake if I talk about it for too long. I can't forget the moment I saw those hands break the surface, or the sound of that faint, despairing voice. That's all I need to know. The lake can keep its secrets, and I'll keep my distance. I'm not looking for closure. I'm just looking to keep my peace of mind. If those sisters are still out there, they're beyond my help, trapped in their own echo of the past. I tried to witness it, and I did. That was enough for one lifetime. I doubt anyone who experiences that place at midnight would argue with me. I left as quickly as I could, and I won't return. I had always heard vague stories about the Livestock Museum in Cheyenne, Wyoming. People said it was locked up tight, full of dusty exhibits no one had touched in years. Most locals rolled their eyes if someone asked about it. They said it wasn't worth the trouble. Still, I'm a journalist for a small paper, and I saw a potential story. I wanted to write an article about forgotten historical spots. A relative of the museum's owner agreed to let me in one afternoon. He gave me a key and said, "Go ahead, but don't blame me if you get spooked." I laughed it off at the time. I arrived that day, parking near a plain two-story building with a faded sign that read, "Livestock Museum." The paint was peeling. The windows looked grimy. There were no lights on inside. The door squeaked when I unlocked it and stepped in. The smell hit me first, a mixture of old leather, stale air, and something like dust-covered wood. I clicked on my flashlight and scanned the entrance. A dusty reception desk stood on my left, and a long corridor stretched out in front of me. The place was quiet enough that I heard my own breathing. I took a few steps forward, shining the flashlight on framed black and white photographs hanging along the walls. They showed cowboys with serious expressions, herding cattle on wide plains. Some shots were dated in the 1920s or 1930s. Their faces stared back at me as I walked. Farther in, there was a large open room with old saddles displayed on wooden stands. A few harnesses and bits were laid out on a table, all marked with little index cards. The entire area smelled like cracked leather. I carefully touched one saddle. Dust rose off it, and the leather squeaked. My pulse sped up for no reason I could name. Maybe it was just the oppressive silence. I moved deeper into the main gallery, aiming my flashlight at various items. Wooden busts of bulls lined one wall, each carved with intense detail. Their eyes were made of glass or some reflective material. I leaned in to inspect one. My reflection flickered in the bull's glass eye, which looked eerily lifelike. I felt a small chill. I told myself it was just the atmosphere and kept going. The corridor split into two directions. I decided to check the side hallway first. That hallway led to narrower rooms. I saw a sign on the wall that said, "Trophies and Mounted Heads." When I pushed open a creaky door, the smell of old taxidermy hit me. The small space was lined with mounts of cattle heads, each with big glass eyes. A few had tags indicating competition wins in the 1950s. I stepped closer to read the fine print on a plaque. Suddenly, I thought I saw one of the heads shift slightly. I paused, heart pounding. I stared hard at it. The head remained perfectly still, mouth parted. The glass eyes reflected my flashlight beam. I tried to calm my breathing. Maybe it was my imagination. I took a couple of photos with my phone's camera. The flash lit up the heads, creating long shadows on the wall. That made me uneasy, so I lowered my phone. As I did, I heard a heavy creak overhead, like someone walking on the floor above me. I froze, flashlight pointing at the ceiling. No one else was supposed to be in the building. I listened for a moment. The steps seemed to move from one side of the upper floor to the other. Then they stopped. My hands felt clammy. I swallowed and told myself old buildings make noises, but these sounded like definite footsteps. I left the taxidermy room, stepping back into the corridor. I aimed my beam at a staircase that led upstairs. The area was roped off, but the rope was old and frayed. I unclipped it and started climbing. Each step squeaked or groaned under my weight. The second floor was mostly a series of narrow halls, each lined with more photos and large frames that described the history of cattle ranching. The lighting fixtures overhead had no electricity running, so everything was dim. I passed a few closed doors before entering a main corridor with more displays. This area had trophies, old spurs, and even a few mannequins dressed like cowboys. Their eyes looked plastic and dull in the flashlight's glare, but their presence made the hall feel crowded. As I walked, I heard a faint noise like distant galloping. It was so soft I wasn't sure at first. Then it grew, echoing through the corridors. It sounded like hooves on hard ground, building up in intensity, then fading away. My heart thumped so loud I felt it in my ears. I wondered if there was an audio system still working somewhere, but I'd seen no sign of electricity. The hairs on my arms stood up. I kept my flashlight aimed down the hall, half expecting to see a stampede of invisible cattle. Nothing appeared, but the sound lingered a moment longer, then stopped abruptly. I continued forward, more cautiously now. My stomach felt tight. I found a smaller room that contained a glass case. Inside it was a set of miniature figures, a scale model of a ranch, complete with little plastic cowboys, horses, and cattle. The sign on the case said, 1958 award-winning display. The tiny figures were arranged as if herding a group of cattle into a pen. I leaned in closer, pressing my flashlight against the glass for a better view. The detail was impressive. Tiny ropes, hats, even facial expressions painted on. Then I saw one of the little cows move. It was a tiny jerk, like it shifted an inch toward the pen gate. I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. My pulse skyrocketed. The flashlight rolled across the floor, casting bouncing beams on the ceiling. I scrambled to grab it, half expecting to see those miniature figures dancing around in the case. By the time I got it, everything inside looked still again. My heart hammered. My palms were sweaty, and I felt a little dizzy. I forced myself to approach the display case once more, shining the light. The figures hadn't changed position in any obvious way, but I couldn't shake the image of that tiny cow inching forward. I took a quick photo with my phone and backed out of the room. I made my way back to the stairs, deciding I'd had enough of the second floor. As I descended, I heard a sudden clatter behind me. I turned and saw a cowboy mannequin leaning oddly, as if it had shifted from its original spot. One arm pointed outward, like it was reaching for me. My chest seized up. I wasted no time and hurried down the steps. Each footstep banged as I nearly tripped on the last few stairs. I needed to get out of that building. On the ground floor, I realized I'd lost track of where the exit was. The corridor seemed longer than before. I felt panic rising in my throat. I shined my flashlight left and right, looking for the main hall that led to the front door. I heard another noise behind me, something like soft breathing or snorting. It was close. I walked faster, almost jogging. My breath came in short bursts, and my heart pounded. At the end of the corridor, I finally spotted the main entrance area. Relief washed over me. I reached the door and fumbled with the lock, managing to pull it open. I stepped outside into the late afternoon sun, gasping. The sudden brightness hurt my eyes. My entire body trembled. I turned around and glanced back into the museum. I couldn't see much because the interior was dark, but for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow on the far wall, tall, with the outline of a cowboy hat. Then it vanished. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and hurried to my car. Sitting in the driver's seat, I tried to steady my breathing. My hands shook as I started the engine. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting something to burst out of the museum after me. Nothing happened. I drove away, forcing myself not to look back. The sense of relief slowly crept in, but my mind spun with confusion and fear. I had no rational explanation for what I saw or heard. That night, I tried reviewing the photos I'd taken on my phone. Most showed dusty exhibits and old photographs, but a few were blurry. One shot of the miniature display had strange streaks of light. Another picture captured the second-floor hallway, and I noticed a faint blur near one of the mannequins, like it was shifting. I felt my stomach tighten again, remembering how I found that mannequin leaning forward, arm raised. Over the next few days, I wrote up a short piece for my paper about the museum's historical significance, leaving out the unsettling details. My editor said it was interesting, but not enough for a full story. I nodded in agreement, relieved I didn't have to share the bizarre events I had experienced. Whenever someone asked if I had discovered anything unusual, I just said it was dusty and eerie. I didn't want to explain how I'd nearly run out of there in panic. A week later, I spoke with the relative who had lent me the key. He laughed when I said the place felt haunted. He told me rumors that the museum held echoes of the Old West. He said a couple of employees disappeared after hours back in the 1970s, but no one had proof of anything sinister. He seemed amused by my discomfort, but he didn't push me for more details. Now, every time I drive through Cheyenne, I avoid that block. I don't want to see the building. I don't want to recall the footsteps overhead, the weird movement in the miniature display, or the feeling that something with hooves was nearby. I still have the pictures on my phone, but I rarely look at them. I can't shake the sense that the museum is stuck in some haunted loop, replaying the life of cowboys and cattle ranchers who never fully left. I can't prove it, but I believe it. My body remembers every jolt of fear from that day. I shared my experience with a close friend who advised me never to go back alone. I don't plan to return at all. Whatever lingers in that museum can stay there. It's not worth another scare. I can handle spooky stories, but living through those unnerving moments was too real. The galloping echoes, the moving taxidermy heads, the miniature figures that seemed alive, those images are still seared into my mind. When I close my eyes, I sometimes see that shadow in a cowboy hat watching me from the corner of the museum corridor. That's all I need to know. The livestock museum can remain closed, as far as I'm concerned. I did my job, took my notes, and left with a memory I'd rather forget. I won't challenge whatever haunts that place again. I heard about the old Estrelado Theater in Phoenix through a friend who knew I liked looking into abandoned venues. He told me the place had been closed for decades, but the owner wanted someone to evaluate the structure for a possible renovation. I'm an actress, so I jumped at the chance. I pictured a quiet, dusty stage where I could imagine past performances. I didn't expect much more than an old building with some broken seats and a few damaged lights. I was wrong. I arrived in the late afternoon. The outside of the theater looked plain, with a worn marquee that had missing letters. The front doors creaked when I pulled them open. The lobby felt stale and smelled like old carpet. I carried a small flashlight and a set of keys the owner had lent me. The light switches along the wall seemed dead. I flipped them anyway. Nothing happened. I shrugged and moved forward. The place was dim, but enough sunlight filtered through cracks in the entrance to guide me. I walked into the main auditorium. Rows of seats spread out across the floor, each covered in a thin layer of dust. A few seats were torn, with stuffing spilling out. I noticed the stage right away. It had a wooden floor, scratched up from years of performances. Overhead, I could see a sky-blue ceiling with small bulb sockets arranged to look like stars. I aimed my flashlight at them. The bulbs were the size of Christmas lights, but none of them lit up when I pressed the switch panel near the stage. The circuit breaker was probably off, or the wiring was damaged. I set my bag down in the front row. I wanted to inspect the backstage area, so I climbed the short steps onto the stage. My footsteps echoed. The boards creaked under my weight. The smell of old wood mixed with stale air made me cough a bit. I turned around to face the audience seats. I wondered what it felt like to perform in this space when it was full of people. That thought excited me. I felt a small surge of energy, like I was stepping into a forgotten history. I continued backstage. The corridors back there were narrow. I saw dressing rooms with shattered mirrors and dusty countertops. A few makeup chairs remained, the vinyl seats cracked. There were random props in one corner, an old trunk, a fake sword with a missing handle, some set pieces shaped like columns. I crouched down to check a piece of broken scenery. Then I heard a light clapping sound. It lasted 2 or 3 seconds, then stopped. My pulse jumped. I listened, holding my breath. The place went silent again. I moved toward the source of the sound, pushing open a door that led to the wings of the stage. It was empty. I noticed a rope pulley system that controlled the curtains and some overhead scenery. Everything looked stiff with age. While I stood there, I felt a faint rush of air, as if someone had run past me. I spun around. No one was there. My heartbeat sped up. I told myself it could be the building settling or some small draft from outside. I decided to step back onto the stage. As I did, I spotted faint footprints in the dust near the center of the floor. The footprints looked fresh, like someone had paced there repeatedly. They led toward the middle of the stage, then stopped abruptly. I knelt down, touched one of the prints, and felt the dust shift under my finger. It definitely wasn't old. My arms prickled with goosebumps. I glanced around. The place was still. I stood up, hearing a faint buzzing noise overhead. I looked up at the ceiling bulbs. A few of them flickered, creating tiny pinpoints of light. They were weak, like dying fireflies. My stomach clenched because I knew there was no active power. I had flipped the switches in the lobby, and nothing worked. I stared at those bulbs as they blinked and pulsed. My throat felt dry. I stepped backward, almost losing my balance. That's when I heard a low mumble coming from somewhere near the stage curtains. It sounded like someone reciting lines in a hushed voice. I froze. My heart thumped so hard I could feel it in my neck. I walked slowly toward the source, sweeping my flashlight over the dusty floor. A shape appeared near the curtain's edge, a person dressed in an outdated costume. Their lips moved, but I couldn't make out the words. My flashlight beam trembled in my hand. I took a step closer, my stomach twisting. The figure flickered like a glitch in an old recording. In a flash, it vanished. I stumbled back, breathing fast. My foot hit something metallic on the ground, sending it clattering. That broke the silence. I heard a rush of whispered voices from all around, like an unseen crowd muttering at once. My heart pounded. The ceiling bulbs above me fluttered, growing a bit brighter, then dimming again. It looked like stars pulsing in a dark sky. I rushed down from the stage, grabbing my bag from the front row. As I did, I caught a glimpse of movement in the seats. I turned my flashlight on the area. For a moment, I thought I saw outlines of people sitting there, staring at the stage. Then they vanished, leaving only the dusty chairs. I felt a chill run down my spine. My breath came in short bursts, and I struggled to keep calm. I told myself to see if the projection booth had any power. Maybe the lights on the ceiling were on some emergency circuit. So I forced myself to walk up the aisle to the back of the theater. Each step felt heavier. My mind raced with questions. Who was that person reciting lines? Why were the seats filled with shadows? At the top of the aisle, I found a narrow staircase that led to the projection room. It smelled of old metal and musty film reels. I pushed open the door and shone my flashlight inside. A dusty projector stood in the center, missing parts. Wires hung from the ceiling, severed. I flipped a breaker switch on the wall, but nothing happened. The place looked like it had been gutted long ago. I turned around, ready to leave, when I heard a quiet applause from the auditorium below. It was a slow clap, the sound echoing off the walls. My mouth went dry. I stepped to the small window in the projection booth that overlooked the theater. When I looked down, the ceiling bulbs glowed a little brighter, forming a weak imitation of a starry night sky. On the stage, I saw a faint shape again. This time, it wore a fancy costume, like from a period drama. It stepped forward and raised its arms as if delivering a grand monologue. I heard muffled words, though I couldn't understand them. The shape flickered in and out of view. My heart pounded against my ribs. I noticed movement in the seats below. Silhouettes of an audience formed briefly, then disappeared. I heard a burst of applause and some excited whispers. The stage figure turned its head in my direction. I felt it look at me, even though I saw no face. A wave of nausea rolled through me, and my legs felt weak. I spun away from the window, gripped the projector for support, and took several deep breaths. I couldn't stay there any longer. I hurried down the stairs, back through the aisle, and toward the exit. As I approached the doors, I heard a loud speaker's voice booming, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Estrelado." It sounded distorted, like an ancient recording on a faulty speaker system. A surge of fear shot through me. I yanked on the doors. They opened with a jolt, allowing a strip of late afternoon sunlight to cut through the darkness. Once I was outside, I leaned against the wall, breathing fast. The sun was setting, painting the street in a dull orange glow. My mind buzzed with what I had seen. The doors behind me stood slightly ajar. I could still sense something inside, like it was watching me. I slammed the doors shut. The key the owner had given me stayed in my pocket. I thought about locking the place, but my hands shook so much I couldn't focus. I decided to leave it as it was. I hurried to my car, got in, and locked the doors. My heart still pounded, and my hands trembled on the steering wheel. I couldn't shake the images of those flickering figures, the half-lit ceiling, and that strange performer reciting lines. My mouth was dry, so I drank from a water bottle. It did little to calm my nerves. The next day I called the owner. I kept my voice even. I said the building needed more work than I thought. He asked if I wanted to move forward with any renovation ideas. I hesitated. The memory of those shadows in the seats was too strong. My stomach clenched as I remembered the whispered voices. I told him I wasn't interested in taking on the project. I never explained why. He might have thought I was just another person unwilling to spend the money. I didn't care. I knew what I had seen in that theater. It didn't need a renovation. It seemed like it was stuck in its own endless performance. I couldn't pretend it was normal. For weeks, I had trouble sleeping. I kept picturing that faint figure on stage, the moment it looked directly at me. My spine would tighten, and I'd jolt awake, sweating. I told a friend about it in vague terms, but he shrugged it off as an overactive imagination. I decided not to push the subject. I haven't been back to the Estrelado since. I don't plan to. I've heard that the building still stands vacant. Occasionally I search for local news, but I find no major updates. No one seems interested in restoring it anymore. If they ask me, I'll say it's better left undisturbed. I can't forget the applause, that wave of sound in an empty hall. It felt like a moment snatched out of time, replaying for anyone foolish enough to walk in. I still feel uneasy whenever I pass through downtown Phoenix, even if I'm nowhere near the old theater district. My shoulders tense, and I remember the star-shaped lights flickering above me. It's a memory I can't erase. In the end, I know what I saw. I know the seats were filled with brief silhouettes that vanished in a blink. I know a costumed figure took center stage without making a sound I could fully understand. I experienced the place as if it were caught mid-performance, waiting for applause that never ends. That's the Estrelado Theater to me, a place still occupied by its final show, unwilling to shut off the lights for good. I'm done with it. Let it stand empty. Let those ghostly performers finish whatever play they began so many decades ago. I want no part of it now, and I'll never set foot in there again. I first heard about that strange barn outside Des Moines from a friend who knew I was interested in local legends. He told me there was a place where the main building never showed up in mirrors, photos, or even puddles of water. I thought he was exaggerating, but I couldn't get the idea out of my head. A few weeks later, I packed my camera, a handheld mirror, and a small video recorder. I drove out there on a late afternoon, following a series of back roads until I reached a worn sign that seemed to mark the property boundary. The path leading to the farmhouse looked rough and uneven, covered in rocks and old tire ruts. Tall grass framed both sides, and I noticed how quiet it was. No passing cars, few birds, nothing but the crunch of gravel under my tires. The sky was turning orange. I didn't want to waste time because the rumor said it was easier to spot any anomaly before the sun went completely down. I parked near a dilapidated fence. I saw the old farmhouse up ahead, a modest wooden structure with peeling paint. Next to it stood a large red barn with chipped paint and missing planks. It looked like any other aging barn from a distance. I grabbed my camera and stepped out of the car. The air felt slightly humid, and I could smell old hay. The wind was mild, lifting the scent of dry grass around me. I approached the house first. The front porch creaked under my weight. The door was closed, but I saw no lock. I knocked a few times. No answer. The place looked abandoned. Through the dusty windows, I could see sparse furniture, maybe a couch and a table. I tried the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. I decided to circle around the building, aiming for the barn. That was the main reason I'd come. On my way, I noticed an old metal wash tub on the ground, half full of cloudy water from recent rain. I knelt down. My own reflection showed up fine in that little puddle. The side of the farmhouse appeared behind me in the reflection, but the barn did not. It should have been visible in the corner, but there was only empty space. My heart thumped in my chest. I twisted my head to double-check. The barn loomed right there, but the water only reflected me, the house, and the dull sky. I tapped the tub's rim. I felt chills spread through my arms. So the rumor was true. I decided to document this. I pulled out my phone and tried to record a short video of the washtub reflection. I tried different angles, yet the barn never appeared in the water. I stood up, feeling uneasy. I took out a small handheld mirror. I turned my back to the barn and tilted the mirror so I could see behind me. I saw the outline of the house, some fence posts, but no barn. I blinked multiple times, adjusting the mirror. Still nothing. It was like the barn wasn't there. My stomach felt tight. I walked closer to the barn. The closer I got, the heavier the air felt. The red paint was faded, and parts of the wooden frame looked warped. I reached the main doors. One of them hung slightly off its hinges. I smelled old manure, along with a faint rancid odor I couldn't place. I pushed the door open, and it scraped against the dirt floor. Inside, it looked dusty and cluttered with broken tools, moldy sacks, and scattered hay. I clicked on a small flashlight I carried, even though enough daylight still filtered in through the gaps. My footsteps stirred up dust motes in the beam of the flashlight. The floor felt uneven, and I almost tripped on a piece of metal. It looked like part of a rusted scythe. I set my camera to record, hoping to capture whatever was inside. When I pointed it at a corner, I heard a faint shuffle. It reminded me of hooves scraping on a hard surface. I paused, scanning for an animal. Nothing moved. The place was thick with that stale smell, and I noticed the remains of a few old stalls. I heard a quiet moo echo from somewhere. My heart skipped. It sounded like a distant cow, but it was low and distorted. I pointed my flashlight, seeing nothing but rotting boards. I moved farther in, stepping over a broken ladder. I felt the temperature drop slightly. My arms broke out in goosebumps. Suddenly, I heard a raspy voice whisper, "Get out." It sounded like it was right behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight across the barn. No one stood there. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I spoke out loud, asking if anyone was there. No answer. I struggled to keep my breathing steady. My hands shook, and I nearly dropped the flashlight. I forced myself to keep going. I noticed an old stairway leading to a loft. The wood looked rotted, but I wanted to see if there was anything up there. I tested each step carefully. The boards creaked, and dust drifted down with each movement. The space overhead had a few open windows, letting in slices of the fading sunlight. Once I reached the top, I could see the barn's rafters. Old rope hung from the beams. Some ropes ended in loops that looked like they once suspended heavy tools or maybe hay bales. It gave me a bad feeling. I saw footprints in the dust, maybe from boots, leading to one side of the loft. I followed them, stepping as quietly as I could. The footprints stopped near a rotted wooden railing. I peered over the edge, down into the main area of the barn. That's when I saw shapes moving below. They looked like black silhouettes of livestock, like cows or horses, but with no color or detail, just dark outlines gliding across the dirt floor. I blinked, trying to adjust my focus. The silhouettes disappeared. My heart banged against my rib cage. I started to question my own vision. As I turned around, my foot caught on a piece of rope, and I stumbled. My hand slammed into a support beam to keep me from falling. That caused a loud thud. Immediately, I heard a shuffle down below, like multiple hooves scurrying. Then everything went silent. My lungs felt tight. I took a moment to gather my wits. Then I checked the video camera. The battery icon blinked, even though I had charged it that morning. Typical. I realized it was nearly dead. I decided I'd seen enough. Something about that barn felt wrong. I didn't want to be there after dark. I inched back down the stairs. On the way out, I heard a noise above me, like beams groaning under weight. It sounded close, so I didn't look up. I just pushed the door open and stepped into the yard again. Relief washed over me to be in the open air. I tried to calm my breathing. I remembered the rumors that the barn had belonged to a family rumored to have performed strange rituals. That might explain the no-reflection stories. As I walked around the barn to take more pictures, I felt an odd sensation of being watched. The sun was setting, painting the sky in purples and reds. I snapped photos of the barn from multiple angles. In every shot, the building looked normal enough. Only the missing reflections gave it away as something else. I decided to do one final experiment. I took a small mirror out and pointed it at the barn again. I could see the fence, the yard, and the empty space where the barn should have been. Then, to my left, I heard what sounded like a large animal huffing. I whipped around, shining the flashlight. The yard was empty. The sound stopped. My skin crawled. I hurried back to my car. Once inside, I locked the doors. My chest felt tight, and I had a slight headache. I scrolled through the pictures on my camera. In them, the barn was visible in the direct photos, but I had a video of the washtub water that showed the barn missing from the reflection. I also had a shot from my handheld mirror that confirmed the same thing. I exhaled heavily. It was enough proof for me. I started the engine. It sputtered a bit before turning over. The evening shadows made the yard look darker. I reversed out, keeping my eyes on the barn as I turned. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing near the doorway, tall, thin, and watching. My headlights flashed over the shape, and then it was gone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I pressed the accelerator and left the property, kicking up gravel behind me. Driving back on those lonely roads, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering tension. I kept replaying the whisper I heard inside the barn, the odd shapes that looked like animals, and the cold feeling in that loft. My mouth was dry, and I sipped some water to steady myself. By the time I reached a more populated area near Des Moines, I felt safer. I stopped at a gas station to collect my thoughts. I looked at my camera footage again. I heard a faint static near the barn's interior recordings, but I couldn't make out the whisper on playback. When I got home, I transferred the files to my computer. All the images and videos were still there, though some frames looked distorted. In the clip with the washtub, the barn area was just a blurry patch, as if the camera had trouble focusing. I knew people would doubt the authenticity, but I had seen it with my own eyes. For days after, I dreamed about that barn. I kept recalling the heavy smell and the sense of being watched. Each time I woke up with a rapid heartbeat. I told a few close friends. Some found it interesting, others laughed, saying it was just camera glitches or a local myth. But I know what I experienced. I remember how my mirror refused to show the barn. I remember hearing "get out" spoken in a voice so close I felt the air shift around my ear. I couldn't explain it. I chose not to go back. The photos and video were enough for me. Sometimes I wonder about the rotting boards in that loft. I wonder how many people stepped foot up there, trying to uncover whatever was hidden. Maybe they never found anything. Maybe they found more than they wanted. All I know is that I felt a presence. It was strong enough to make the hairs on my arms stand straight. Even now, thinking about it causes a knot in my stomach. I decided to share my story online, hoping to find others who had seen the same thing. A few people claimed to know the barn, though they provided few additional details. Some said the family who owned it vanished under strange circumstances. Others mentioned a set of diaries locked away in the house, describing rituals with farm animals. I didn't try to dig deeper. I had enough nightmares already. To this day, I avoid that area near Des Moines whenever possible. It's not that I'm terrified all the time, but I don't see any reason to tempt fate by returning. I have my photos and my memories. That's enough to convince me. The barn with no reflection is real, and whatever force keeps it hidden from mirrors or water is beyond my understanding. I felt it in every step I took among the rotted beams and dusty corners, and I'll never forget the moment I realized that, even though I could see the barn clearly, the world's reflections showed only emptiness where it stood. I arrived at the old Art Deco hotel in Chicago on a Wednesday afternoon, already feeling tired from the flight. I was there for a conference about urban architecture. The place had a grand lobby with tall ceilings, ornate moldings, and polished floors. Groups of people moved in and out, some dragging suitcases, others chatting near the plush chairs. I checked in at the front desk, got my key card, and asked for directions to the conference room. The clerk told me it was on the 19th floor. Then I noticed something unusual. The lobby's main elevator bank showed only 20 floors, but I could see part of the building had more. I figured maybe some top floors were for staff or storage. I settled into my room on the 17th floor. Everything looked standard. Beige walls, a simple bed, a TV. I freshened up, then headed to the conference. People were milling about, discussing architectural trends. I participated in a few sessions and felt a bit more energetic by evening. That night, after dinner, I wandered around the hotel, exploring the corridors. I had an interest in old buildings, especially ones with hidden corners or outdated features that never got renovated. As I strolled past the main elevator bank, I spotted a small elevator tucked away behind a decorative wall near the far end of the lobby. It had an old-fashioned door and a tarnished metal frame. There was no signage pointing to it. Most guests seemed unaware it existed. I approached it out of curiosity. The panel inside had buttons that didn't match the main elevators. They were smaller, with script-style numbers. Some were faded. I saw floors marked 1 through 20, but there were additional buttons that showed odd symbols. One button had a B that looked inverted, like it was stamped the wrong way. Another button had a faint 22, but it was scratched out. I pressed the elevator's door close button and expected it to do nothing because these old lifts often needed a key. To my surprise, the doors slid shut without hesitation. I felt a slight jolt as it began moving upward. Then it stopped at my floor. The doors opened normally. I stepped out, glancing back to see if I had just imagined the strange panel. It was still there, dimly lit. I shrugged it off and returned to my room for the night. The next day went by quickly with more conference sessions. By late evening, the crowd had thinned out, and I felt that familiar itch to explore again. I went back to the lobby around midnight, figuring it would be empty. Sure enough, only a tired desk clerk stood there, barely paying attention to me. I moved toward that old elevator. My heart beat faster, more from excitement than fear. I stood inside, my finger hovering over the strange buttons. I pressed the inverted B button. The elevator doors slid shut, and the car moved downward, past the lobby level. The digital readout above the door blinked B1, B2, then went blank. My stomach knotted. I felt a subtle shift in air temperature. It seemed colder. When it finally stopped, there was a slight shudder, and the doors opened onto a dim corridor. The lights flickered weakly, and the air smelled stale, like damp carpet and old furniture. My breath came faster. I knew the hotel had only 1 or 2 regular basement levels for storage. This place looked different. It was decorated in an outdated style, with Art Deco trim along the walls. It felt like I had stepped back in time, except everything looked worn and abandoned. I heard a faint drip, possibly water leaking somewhere. The silence felt heavy, pressing on my eardrums. I stepped out, leaving 1 foot in the elevator. I didn't want the door to shut on me without warning. I leaned forward and aimed my phone's flashlight down the corridor. The wallpaper was faded, with patterns that had probably been beautiful decades ago. Now they were peeling at the corners. Doors lined the hallway, each with a brass plaque reading "Suite" and a number. I expected storage rooms, not full suites. My heart pounded. I forced myself to move slowly, shining the light on the floor to avoid broken tiles or stray debris. The door to the first suite on my left had a chipped handle. I turned it gently and found it locked. The next door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The room smelled of mold and stale perfume. Inside, I saw a dusty lounge area with old furniture covered in sheets. Shadows jumped around as my flashlight beam wavered. I heard a faint rustling, like fabric sliding across the floor. I froze, scanning the area. The sheets on the furniture remained still. I took another step in and felt my pulse spike. I heard a muffled laugh from behind a closed door inside the suite, maybe leading to a bedroom. It sounded like people talking. The voices were too distant to make out words, but the tone was casual, like a small gathering. My scalp tingled. I retreated into the hallway, not eager to confront whatever was in that room. As I stepped back, I saw the corridor extend farther, turning a corner. A faint glow came from around that bend. My stomach tightened, but I walked toward it. My shoes squeaked on the old floor, and each step echoed more than I liked. When I turned the corner, I found a larger space, like a small ballroom or lounge area. The walls had dark wood panels, and a grand light fixture hung from the ceiling, its bulbs flickering faintly. A few chairs and small tables were arranged near the walls, covered in layers of dust. I noticed a faint tune, like old jazz music, drifting through the air. It sounded distant, as if played on a static-filled gramophone. My heart thudded. I swept the room with my flashlight, seeing no audio source. Then, in the far corner, I spotted movement. It took me a second to realize I was seeing shapes that looked like people in formal attire. They were transparent enough that I could make out the wall behind them. My chest went cold. They moved in slow, deliberate motions, like dancing at a formal gathering. One figure seemed to pivot toward me. Its face had no clear features, more of a smudged outline. I felt my body go rigid. I backed up, swallowing hard, my breath shallow. As I retreated, the flickering lights dimmed. The music cut off abruptly, leaving only the creak of the floor under my shoes. The figures dissolved into the shadows. My flashlight flickered. I turned around, nearly stumbling over a broken piece of furniture, and hurried back the way I came. I had trouble keeping my balance. The hallway seemed darker now. My heart pounded so hard that I heard a pulse in my ears. I kept thinking about how deep this level was below the lobby. None of it made sense. The voices, the dancing shapes, the old decor, it felt like a hidden world left to rot. I found my way back to the elevator, relieved to see the doors still open. I jumped in and pressed the button for the lobby. Nothing happened. My mouth went dry. The elevator panel didn't light up. I pressed it again, feeling my pulse race. Eventually, the doors slid shut and the car lurched upward. The overhead light flickered. My stomach churned as I felt the elevator pass several floors. Then it stopped abruptly, and the door opened to a corridor that looked even more decayed than the one below. My eyes widened in panic. This was not the lobby. I stabbed the door close button frantically. The door shut, and the car went up again, this time for what felt like a long stretch. Finally, it opened on the main lobby. Relief flooded me. I staggered out, breathing hard. The lobby looked just as it had before. The desk clerk was still there, barely glancing my way. I turned around to see if the old elevator was still present. The wall was smooth, with no sign of a door. My heart slammed against my ribs. I stared at the spot where I knew I had entered. It was just a blank section of the lobby wall with a decorative pattern. No elevator entrance at all. I hurried to the front desk. The clerk gave me a polite smile. I tried to explain what had happened, but my voice shook. The clerk looked confused. He said the hotel only had the main bank of elevators. I insisted there was another old elevator near the corner of the lobby. He walked with me to check, and we found nothing but that same decorated wall. He looked at me with concerned eyes, like maybe I was overtired. I forced a laugh and said I might have mixed up my directions. I could still feel sweat on my forehead and a tremor in my legs. I went straight to my room, locked the door, and tried to calm down. My mind wouldn't stop replaying the images, the dusty corridor, the faint music, the dancing figures, and that room that smelled of stale perfume. I told myself I should leave the hotel, but my flight was scheduled for the next afternoon, and I didn't have enough money to book another place. I stayed awake for hours, jumping at every small noise in the hallway. Finally, around dawn, I packed my things and went downstairs, hoping to check out early. The desk clerk had changed shifts. The new person also smiled politely as I asked about the hotel's basement levels. She said there were only 2 sub-basements used for maintenance, not open to guests. I didn't bother arguing. I just wanted to leave. I handed over my key, got my receipt, and walked out into the morning light. The street noise of Chicago almost felt comforting compared to that silent corridor. I caught a taxi to the airport hours before my flight. I couldn't stand the idea of hanging around the lobby, worrying that old elevator might appear again. I sat at the airport gate, trying to focus on mundane details like flight times and the taste of cheap coffee. But my thoughts kept drifting back to the ghostly shapes in that deserted ballroom. I could still sense the stale air in my lungs. My hands trembled whenever I recalled the moment the elevator refused to go back to the lobby at first. I ended up leaving Chicago that afternoon, relieved to watch the city skyline shrink in the plane window. That night, in my own home, I dreamed about that corridor. In the dream, the elevator doors wouldn't open at all, and I was stuck inside while muffled voices laughed just outside. I woke up sweating. I knew I wouldn't forget that basement floor. It felt like a hidden part of the hotel's past, a place that refused to be erased. I still have no explanation. All I know is that I saw a portion of the building that staff denied existed. I heard voices and music that didn't match any modern event, and I left with a deep sense of unease. convinced that somewhere beneath the polished Art Deco facade, there is a place sealed away, alive in its own shadowed reality. I arrived in Duluth on a cloudy afternoon, determined to see the old boathouse people kept talking about. I had heard local stories about voices echoing at dusk and unexplained activity along the waterfront. I'm a sports photographer, and I've spent plenty of time near bodies of water, capturing kayaking tournaments and sailing events. But I'd never run into anything I would call supernatural. I wanted to find out if the rumors were true or just local folklore. That curiosity was my main motivation. I planned to take photos, record ambient sounds, and document the condition of the abandoned boathouse. I thought I could handle whatever I found. The area around Lake Superior felt quiet that day, almost too still. When I got close to the boathouse, I noticed there were no recent tire marks or footprints. The outside looked neglected, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. It sat at the edge of a worn dock that creaked under my steps. I had my camera bag slung over my shoulder, and I moved carefully because some of the boards felt loose beneath my feet. A faint smell of algae rose from the water. I could see a few old canoes through the boathouse's open doors. I stepped inside, and the first thing I noticed was a thick layer of dust on every surface. Rusty metal parts lay scattered near some worn-out wooden beams. The air felt stale, almost suffocating. My shoes made scraping sounds on the concrete floor, and each step kicked up small puffs of dust. I could see half-submerged boats in the corners, some missing seats. The entire place looked like it had been abandoned after a sudden closure. I checked for signs of squatters or recent visitors, but I didn't see any. No fresh footprints. No footprints at all, actually. I started snapping photos right away. I wanted to document everything. I took pictures of old life jackets piled on a table, broken oars, and rotted ropes coiled near the dock entrance. Then I heard a faint sound of laughter. It stopped so quickly that I questioned if I had imagined it. I lowered my camera and listened carefully. The wind outside was mild, so it couldn't have been a gust whistling through the gaps in the boathouse. My heart picked up speed. I glanced around, but still saw nothing moving. I tried to focus on capturing more images, pushing the strange noise to the back of my mind. About 10 minutes later, I moved to a narrow hallway that led to some storage rooms. That area smelled of wet wood and mold. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I saw old signage on the wall. It mentioned a regatta from 1952 with a list of participants. The date caught my eye. It felt odd to see such a clear record of an event from so long ago. The color was faded, and the paper had moisture stains. I took a few shots of it, thinking it might be a valuable piece of history for the local archives. While I was focusing my lens, I heard what sounded like wet footsteps. It was a splashing noise, almost like someone walking in shallow water. My throat went dry. The sound was faint but rhythmic, getting closer. I stopped taking photos and held my breath. The noise moved past me, then faded away as if it had gone deeper into the boathouse. I stood still, my palms starting to sweat. I considered calling out, but the fear in my gut told me to stay quiet. There was no reason for anyone else to be here, especially walking in water that I couldn't see. I forced myself to keep moving forward. My chest felt tight, and I caught myself holding my camera in a tense grip. I edged around a corner, shining a small flashlight into the next section. That's when I found a single wooden rowboat leaning against a ramp. Its paint was chipped, and it had a faint outline of a name on the side, letters too worn to read. I knelt down to get a better angle for a photo. The boat looked like it hadn't been moved in decades, but it also had no dust on its top edge. The rest of the boathouse was covered in dust, so why was this rowboat's top edge so clean? I snapped 3 pictures. My heart was still thumping in my ears. I stood up and caught a reflection on the water below the dock. I turned my flashlight on the surface. For a split second, I saw the shape of a man wearing a sailor's cap. He appeared to be standing behind me. I spun around so fast that I nearly dropped my flashlight, but there was no one there. My heartbeat pounded. My mouth tasted bitter. I aimed the flashlight around, searching for any sign of a person. I saw only damp walls and piles of rotted wood. The place felt heavy, like a weight had settled in the air, making it hard to breathe normally. I tried to calm myself by focusing on my reason for coming here. I was a photographer. I needed to gather evidence. I took more shots of the rowboat and the dripping beams overhead. Then I turned off my flashlight for a moment to see if I could catch any movement in the darkness. That was a mistake. In the sudden blackness, I heard distant voices again. They sounded like excited shouts, as if a group was celebrating a good day's catch. The laughter had a strange echo, a hollow ring. My pulse raced. I fumbled to turn the flashlight back on, but my hands shook. Once the beam was on again, the voices vanished. Nothing stirred in the shadows. I decided I needed fresh air, so I headed back toward the entrance of the boathouse. My steps felt quicker than before. My breath came in shallow bursts. I kept glancing over my shoulder. Just before I reached the exit, I heard the rattling of metal objects behind me. It sounded like chains, or maybe those old mooring ropes hitting against something. I turned around one last time. I saw no people, but the dull clang continued for a second, then stopped. My heart hammered. I stepped outside and exhaled, relieved to feel a breeze on my face. The sun was lowering over Lake Superior, and the sky had that grayish tint. I put my camera away and walked along the dock to get a better angle of the boathouse for a wide shot. The silence over the water felt unnatural, as if everything was holding its breath. Then, on the far side, I noticed a canoe drifting slowly. It wasn't new, but it also didn't look waterlogged. I saw no one inside it. It glided across the surface toward the center of the lake. My mind raced with questions. Was someone controlling it by remote? Was it caught in a current? The water was calm, so it shouldn't have moved that steadily on its own. I aimed my camera, snapping as many photos as I could. The canoe kept moving until it stopped about 30 feet away. Then it tilted, as if someone inside shifted weight. But the canoe was empty. I felt a chill roll up my arms. Suddenly, the canoe flipped over, creating a small splash. It sank so slowly that I watched every inch disappear under the dark water. My throat felt tight. My heart pounded. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was rotted and sank because of a leak, but that didn't explain its smooth movement across the lake. I took a step toward the edge of the dock, desperate to see any sign of the canoe re-emerging. The water stayed still. I noticed my own reflection trembling on the surface. I waited, but nothing broke through again. The sun was nearly gone, and I realized I had no intention of staying once darkness covered the lake. I felt exposed. I felt like someone or something was watching. My arms felt cold. My stomach churned. I backed away, nearly stumbling on a loose board. The next day, I visited a local cafe and asked some townspeople if they'd heard about that boathouse. A few mentioned an accident during a regatta decades ago. Some participants never returned to shore, and their bodies were never found. People said they occasionally heard rowing sounds or glimpsed old boats on the water at dusk. One man told me that canoes sometimes floated by without anyone inside. He shrugged like it was normal. Another woman told me she wouldn't go near the boathouse at night. She said she'd heard too many stories from her grandparents about ghostly crews preparing for one last race they never finished. I sat there, stirring my coffee, replaying the events in my head. Each time I recalled the laughter or the splashing footsteps, my shoulders tensed. My body had a physical reaction, like it was rejecting the memory. I told a couple of them about the canoe that sank. They just nodded in that resigned way, like they'd heard it all before. I asked if anyone had tried to clean up the boathouse or restore it. Most people avoided the topic. They said it was best left alone, as if disturbing the place might invite more trouble. After that, I packed up my camera and notes. I decided I wasn't going back to that boathouse at night. I had enough material for my project. I had enough strange images and unsettling audio clips to last me a lifetime. My priority was to keep my peace of mind. Whenever I recalled that reflection of the man behind me, I felt a prickling at the back of my neck. It's like my body remembered the exact moment my flashlight revealed an empty space that should have held someone. I still keep those photographs on a separate drive. The images of the rowboat and the partially flooded interior show a decaying building, but there's also a strange blur in some shots. In one photo, I can almost make out a faint silhouette on the far side of the boathouse, though I can't confirm it's a person. I don't show that picture to many people. I'm not trying to prove a ghost story. I just know what I saw and heard. I haven't returned to the boathouse, and I don't plan to. I stay away from that area at dusk. The memory of that canoe flipping and sinking without anyone inside is enough to keep me from revisiting. Every time I pass near the lake, I feel my stomach tense, and I check the shore for any drifting boats. I don't see them, but I still feel uneasy. It's like the air around Duluth carries a hint of that old place. Maybe that's enough for me. I got my evidence, and I don't need more. I know some people will never believe this story. They'll say it was an illusion or my imagination. That's fine. I remember every moment clearly. I can't explain why I heard those voices or how the canoe moved. I just know I was there, camera in hand, eyes wide open, heart pounding. That's the truth of it. And that's more than enough reason to avoid that garage of boats in the future. I knew something was off the moment I heard other drivers talk about that old gas station on the outskirts of Amarillo. They kept telling stories about lights flickering when no power lines were connected and voices echoing from empty rooms. I decided to check it out one evening because my route was headed in that direction. I was curious, and I didn't scare easy. I've been on the road for years. I've seen old rest stops, abandoned motels, strange folks at diners in the middle of nowhere. But the rumors about this place made me pay attention. They said it closed in the 1960s after a new highway bypassed it, and no one ever reopened it. Every now and then, though, travelers claimed they saw headlights and heard people chatting at the pumps. It sounded ridiculous, but I wanted to see for myself. I pulled off the main road around dusk. The sun was low, and the sky over Amarillo glowed orange and purple. I saw the old station set back from a stretch of cracked asphalt. The structure looked small, with a sagging roof and battered signs leaning at odd angles. A few rusted pumps stood out front, their hoses cut off or dangling. Pieces of old cardboard and plastic had piled up near the entrance. No bright neon, no posted prices, no sign of life. I parked my rig on a patch of dirt next to the station and shut off the engine. The sudden silence made my ears ring. I walked toward the pumps. My boots crunched on gravel. The wind tasted dry. I tried to switch on my flashlight, but the battery was weak. The sun's last light gave me enough to see old paint flaking off the main sign. I could still read something about regular and premium, but the letters had faded to a dull brownish color. I stood there and listened. No traffic in the distance, no birds, just a faint breeze. I remember feeling my shoulders tense up because the place felt stuck in another time. I noticed the main door was partially open, so I stepped inside. The floor was covered in dust, wrappers, and shredded papers. A few metal chairs and a counter took up most of the space. An old rack with road maps lay toppled in a corner. The air smelled stale, like old cardboard mixed with rust. I slid my boot over a few scattered documents on the floor. Some were receipts, and some had dates from the early 1960s. I crouched down and picked one up. It showed an oil change record for a car from 1961. Something about that gave me chills. It felt like stepping into a sealed time capsule. As I stood, I heard a light jingling sound. It reminded me of the little bell that rings when someone opens a door to a convenience store. It was faint and quick, like a ding. My pulse jumped. I turned around fast. The door hadn't moved. There was no one in sight. I told myself it could be a piece of metal somewhere, just shifting in the wind. But the door to the outside was still cracked the same amount. I swallowed hard. I felt a tingle in my arms. I told myself not to be stupid. I decided to walk to the window and look out. The sky was turning darker. The first stars were out. I stared at the old pumps and caught a glimpse of something that looked like a car parked at the far side of the lot. It had an old-fashioned body, maybe from the 1950s. A man in a uniform stood next to it, talking to somebody inside. My mind froze. It felt real, as if I could reach out and tap on the glass. I blinked, and the scene vanished. The pumps were empty. No car, no man. Just my heartbeat pounding in my ears. My hands started shaking. I let the slip of paper drop to the floor. I told myself it could have been a reflection or a trick of the light. I stepped back from the window and turned around. The place was quiet again. My mind kept going over it. An actual car, a driver, and a gas station attendant. It all disappeared the instant I blinked. I blew out a breath and took a moment to calm myself. I walked outside. The temperature felt a bit cooler. The pumps were as rusted as before, and they looked so old and dead that I found it impossible that someone had used them recently. I approached the farthest pump. The nozzle hung loosely. I touched it, and it felt cold and rough. Just as I was about to walk away, I heard a metallic click. I spun around. The handle on the second pump twitched on its own, like someone had squeezed it. My mouth went dry, and I took a step back. Then I noticed a drop of fluid at the tip of the nozzle. It wasn't thick enough to be fresh gasoline, but it dripped onto the concrete. I froze, swallowing repeatedly. It was too dark to see the exact color. My chest felt tight. I started to reach for the handle, and I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me. Quick, purposeful footsteps. I whipped around, expecting to see a person. Nothing. I shone my weak flashlight around. The beam flickered across the cracked pavement. No one was there. I scanned the pumps. I checked behind a small cluster of weeds. No movement. I let out a shaky breath and realized I was breathing hard. My mouth felt chalky. I was definitely spooked, but I didn't want to leave just yet. Part of me needed to know more. I went back to my truck, locking myself inside the cabin. The interior light cast a dull glow on my seat and the dashboard. I tried to settle my nerves. I told myself the old gas station had an atmosphere that played tricks on the mind, especially near dusk. Sometimes the mind sees what it wants to see in a creepy place. But that logic didn't erase the memory of the old car or the footsteps I'd heard. It also didn't explain the drip of liquid from that ancient pump. I decided to spend the night there. I found a spot to park just off to the side, under a bent light pole. I locked the doors. I had enough supplies in my cooler, and I felt safer in my truck than out wandering around. Around midnight, I jerked awake in the driver's seat. I dozed off. My arms felt cramped. My neck ached. I saw bright lights in my side mirror. For a second, I thought it was another truck. Then I noticed they were the headlights of a classic car. They had that older shape with round beams. They were pointed right at my mirror, almost blinding me. My heart thumped. I turned around to check, and the headlights switched off. The area went dark again. I opened the window slightly, letting the night air in, and I listened. I didn't hear an engine. I waited for at least a minute, my eyes straining. I saw no movement. Eventually, I closed the window and locked up again. The adrenaline made it hard to go back to sleep. My head pounded with questions, and my chest felt tight. I kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe I dreamed the whole thing. Maybe it was just passing cars from the main road, though the angle was odd. Morning came, and the place looked less frightening. The sun lit up the cracked asphalt and the dusty edges of the station. I decided to step out and stretch. I smelled the dry air. I took in the sight of the rundown building one more time. I felt calmer in the daylight, as if I'd just woken from a strange nightmare. But the memories were too vivid. The drop of liquid, the old car, the footsteps, the headlights, they all stuck in my mind with a clarity I couldn't dismiss. I drove out of there, following the old route back to the main highway. I stopped at the next truck stop for some coffee and breakfast. My hands were steady again, and the normal sounds of people talking and dishes clanking helped me relax. I told a couple of other drivers about what happened. They nodded like they'd heard it all before. One older guy said he'd stopped there once and had a similar experience with footsteps and flickering lights. Another driver said he'd heard rumors of people seeing old-timey vehicles, hearing horns, and glimpsing a uniformed attendant who vanished if you walked too close. I listened to those stories, and my stomach turned. It matched too closely with what I'd seen. I wasn't the only one who felt or heard these things at that place. They mentioned that the station seemed stuck in its prime era. Some travelers reported seeing glimpses of it as though it were active, with bright signage and employees working. Then everything vanished in a blink. That made the hair on my arms stand up, because it was exactly how that old car and uniformed man looked to me, like they stepped out of a different decade. I'm not the superstitious type. I don't buy into ghost tales easily, but I can't deny what I saw and heard that night. Something about that station is frozen in time. It feels as though it's playing out the same moments over and over. Maybe it's just echoes of the past. Maybe it's some weird energy left behind by the folks who worked and stopped there so many years ago. I don't have an explanation. I drove away with my heart still beating fast, thinking about how real it all was. I could still picture the driver's face through the old car window and the uniformed man leaning toward him. They looked occupied with a normal, everyday conversation, as though I was the intruder in their world. I could almost hear them exchanging a few words about gas prices or directions, but in total silence. Those moments I saw them felt longer than they probably were. Once I got back on the road, I tried to focus on the day ahead and my next delivery. My mind kept drifting, though. The image of those flickering headlights in my mirror clung to my memory. Each time I thought about it, my pulse raced. By the time I reached my next stop, I felt worn out. My back was stiff, and my stomach was sour. I told a few more people what had happened. Some laughed, Others shrugged. A couple said they'd heard of that place. They'd never go near it. I continued my route, and after a few days, the fear subsided. It turned into a strange curiosity instead. I wondered who the people were. I wondered how they got stuck there. Every time I shared the story, I felt a little less anxious about it. But I also felt a chill each time I remembered the drip from that pump nozzle. I can still see that bead of fluid hanging off the metal tip. I know the station had been out of operation for decades, so where did that come from? I don't have a rational answer. I haven't gone back, though the route still takes me near Amarillo sometimes. If I pass by that same side road, I feel a heaviness in my chest. I always see that silhouette of the old station in the distance, and I get a prickle of goosebumps. I wonder if there are ghostly drivers there at that very moment, stepping out of their cars, paying for gas, never realizing they're in some loop. I can't prove it, but I saw enough to make me trust my own senses that night. I plan to keep driving long haul for a few more years. If I hear more stories from other truckers, I'll pay attention. That station is now a permanent part of my memory. I won't forget the silent shuffle of footsteps on the gravel or the fleeting image of the man in uniform. It felt real in a way that's hard to describe without sounding crazy. But I know what happened. My shoulders still tighten when I think back on it. My hands still clamp the steering wheel a bit harder when I pass through that area. I'll never take that old side road at dusk again. If I do, I'll probably feel the same creeping tension in my neck, the same dryness in my mouth, the same racing pulse in my chest. I'll always wonder if, just beyond the pumps, there's an old car that might appear from nowhere, headlights shining at my truck. Even now, just remembering it makes me uneasy. That's enough to convince me to leave the place alone. It doesn't matter if anyone believes my story. I know what I saw, and that's enough.